Beneath the dense canopy of the world's most remote forests, over jagged mountain ridges and across rivers few have dared to navigate, entire expeditions have vanished without a trace. You move alongside them now, feeling the chill of misted valleys and the weight of shadowed pines, tracing the paths where explorers disappeared into the unknown. Some never returned from the Arctic tundra, others from humid, insect-choked jungles, and still more from deserts where sand swallows footprints in hours. Each disappearance tells a story of ambition, miscalculation, and the unforgiving silence of untamed wilderness. As you follow the faint echoes of those who went before, you will encounter abandoned camps, cryptic journals, and landscapes that seem to resist human intrusion, leaving behind questions that refuse answers and a mystery that lingers long after the trail has ended. The Franklin Expedition, 1845. In the middle of the 19th century, when maps still carried wide blank spaces and the Arctic remained a realm of conjecture, the British Admiralty prepared what it believed would be the expedition to finally master the northern frontier. The ambition was not reckless by the standards of the era. It was framed as the logical culmination of decades of polar exploration, backed by the world's most powerful navy and the confidence of industrial progress. Yet from the moment the ships slipped beyond the last familiar ports, the Franklin expedition began to drift into a category reserved for undertakings that would never fully return, not even in memory. Sir John Franklin departed England in May 1845 aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terra, carrying 129 officers and men toward the Canadian Arctic in search of the Northwest Passage. Both vessels were veterans of Antarctic service, reinforced for ice and outfitted with steam engines adapted from railway locomotives, a symbol of how Victorian engineering believed itself capable of overcoming any environment. The crews were supplied for at least 3 years, including thousands of tins of preserved food, and Franklin himself was a seasoned explorer with prior Arctic experience. Officially, there was little reason to expect disaster, and early sightings by whalers in Baffin Bay confirmed that the expedition appeared well provisioned and orderly as it entered Lancaster Sound. After that summer, the expedition vanished into the Arctic archipelago, threading its way between islands where pack ice shifted unpredictably and winter temperatures could render even simple tasks dangerous. The ship spent the winter of 1845-1846 at Beechey Island, a place that later searchers would recognise by 3 carefully marked graves, evidence that death had already begun its quiet work among the crew. When spring returned, Franklin pressed southward through Peel Sound, a route that would later prove navigable in better years but was catastrophically choked with ice during the late 1840s. By September 1846, Erebus and Terra became locked fast off the northwest coast of King William Island, unable to move as the ice hardened around their hulls. For nearly 2 years the ships remained trapped, a floating settlement slowly becoming a prison. Franklin died on June 11, 1847, though the cause was never recorded, leaving command to Captain Francis Crozier and Captain James Fitzjames. The Arctic did not loosen its grip, and by April 1848, with supplies dwindling and no sign of release, the remaining 105 men abandoned the ships and attempted to march south toward the Back River, more than 1,000 kilometres away. This decision, documented in a single note later found in a stone cairn, is one of the few direct messages the expedition ever left behind. That message, now known as the Victory Point Record, was brief, factual, and chilling in its restraint. It confirmed the ship's position, Franklin's death, and the intention to begin an overland retreat, offering no hint of the conditions that forced men trained for naval discipline to drag boats and supplies across frozen terrain. Inuit oral histories, collected decades later, described small groups of exhausted white men pulling sledges, collapsing from hunger and cold and dying along the coast. These accounts, dismissed for years and later reconsidered, form some of the earliest clues to what happened after the abandonment. Search expeditions sent in the 1850s began to uncover physical evidence scattered across the landscape, each find raising more questions than answers. Skeletons were discovered along the southern coast of King William Island, some with cut marks on bones that suggested cannibalism, a conclusion deeply uncomfortable for Victorian Britain. Cooking pots contained human remains, and personal items were found far from any logical travel route, including silverware engraved with officers' names, discarded like useless weight. The pattern suggested not an organised retreat, but a gradual collapse under conditions that stripped away rank, order and hope. The environment itself played an unrelenting role in shaping the expedition's fate. The Arctic winter imposed months of darkness, extreme cold and isolation that no amount of planning could fully mitigate. Scurvy likely weakened many of the men, despite the Admiralty's belief that preserved food would prevent it. At the same time, later testing of remains revealed elevated lead levels, possibly linked to poorly soldered food tins or the ship's water systems. These factors alone do not explain the expedition's total disappearance, but they help illuminate how a well-equipped force could deteriorate so completely. For decades, the exact resting places of Erebus and Terra remained unknown, adding a maritime silence to the human tragedy. Searchers combed charts and coastlines, convinced that the ships themselves might still hold answers locked within their hulls. When Erebus was finally discovered in 2014 in relatively shallow water, followed by Terra in 2016, the finds confirmed Inuit accounts that the vessels had drifted south after being abandoned. Remarkably preserved by cold, dark water, they offered the possibility of recovering logs, artifacts, and perhaps even the unspoken sequence of decisions that doomed the expedition. Even with these discoveries, the Franklin expedition resists a single clean explanation. No final log has been recovered that describes the last months in detail, and no survivor lived to tell the story from within the ranks. What remains is a reconstruction built from fragments, bones weathered by wind, written notes meant never to be read by the world, and oral histories passed quietly across generations. Each element clarifies part of the narrative while leaving the larger picture unresolved. The expedition's disappearance reshaped Arctic exploration and altered Britain's understanding of the polar regions. It spurred more than 30 search missions, mapped vast stretches of previously unknown territory, and embedded the Arctic in the public imagination as a place that demanded humility rather than conquest. Yet for all the knowledge gained, the human story at its centre remains incomplete, defined more by absence than by certainty. The Franklin expedition is remembered not simply for failing to return, but for how thoroughly it dissolved into the landscape it sought to master. More than a century later, the men of Erebus and Terra still occupy a space between history and mystery, their final days inferred rather than known, their voices preserved only through indirect traces. The Arctic has kept its secrets well, revealing just enough to suggest the scale of the ordeal without ever offering a full confession. What happened between the moment the ships were abandoned and the last breath taken along the frozen coast remains suspended in silence. And somewhere beneath the ice-dark water and barren shorelines, the unanswered details of that march south still wait, unchanged by time and untouched by certainty. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, 1959. On a frozen January morning in 1959, a small group of Soviet hikers set out across the northern Ural Mountains, with a route carefully logged and no expectation that their journey would become one of the most scrutinized wilderness expeditions never to return. Led by Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, the group planned a ski trek toward Mount Overton, a demanding but attainable objective for experienced winter hikers. Their documents were precise, their permits approved, and their departure routine enough that nothing about the start suggested danger beyond what Arctic conditions already imposed. The wilderness they entered was harsh but familiar, a place measured in gradients, snowpack, and endurance rather than myth. Unlike exploratory missions driven by discovery or conquest, this trek was organised as a qualification climb, planned by experienced students who had already endured some of the harshest terrain the Soviet Union could offer. All 9 members who continued beyond the last settlement were classified as Grade 2 or 3 hikers, the highest levels at the time, and several had prior experience in long-distance winter expeditions. They travelled with standardised equipment, shared responsibilities, and an expectation of self-reliance shaped by Soviet outdoor culture. The group dynamic, recorded in photographs and journals recovered later, shows discipline and familiarity rather than tension, with no sign that internal conflict or fear marked the early stages of the journey. Before the expedition reached the upper slopes of Kholat-Syakhl, every recorded decision reflected methodical preparation rather than haste, even as weather and visibility began to deteriorate. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back due to worsening health on February 2nd, reducing the group to 9 and providing the last confirmed survivor's account. The remaining hikers adjusted their course to compensate for snowdrifts and wind, choosing a slope campsite rather than descending into the forest, a choice debated endlessly afterward but not unprecedented in severe winter travel. Their final diary entries and photographs show normal routines, including equipment checks and shared meals, without any indication that danger was imminent. When the hikers failed to send their expected confirmation of safe return, the absence did not immediately signal catastrophe, but it introduced a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. Delays were common in winter expeditions, and search efforts were not initiated until February 20th, when relatives and fellow students pressed for action. Volunteer groups and later military units began combing the region, contending with deep snow and limited visibility that slowed progress. The expectation at this stage was rescue or recovery, under difficult conditions, not the unravelling of a mystery. The first sign that something had gone profoundly wrong appeared not in the form of bodies, but in a partially collapsed tent discovered on an exposed incline. The shelter was still anchored to the slope, its contents largely intact, including boots, coats, food supplies, and personal items that would have been essential for survival. Most unsettling were the slashes in the tent fabric, clearly made from the inside, suggesting a rapid exit rather than a controlled departure. The scene presented a contradiction that would define the entire case, as trained hikers appeared to have fled into sub-zero darkness without protection. Below the campsite, along a descending path toward the forest, searchers encountered the initial remains positioned in ways that defied both survival instinct and environmental logic. 2 bodies were found near a cedar tree, barefoot or wearing only socks, with signs they had attempted to build a small fire. Further upslope, 3 more were located between the tree and the tent, arranged as though they had tried to return but collapsed along the way. Exposure was evident, yet the spacing and orientation of the bodies suggested purposeful movement interrupted rather than random disintegration. As the recovery efforts continued outward from that slope, each discovery added physical detail while stripping away any simple explanation. Months later, when snowmelt allowed further searches, 4 additional bodies were found in a ravine, buried beneath several meters of snow. These hikers were better dressed, some wearing clothing belonging to others, indicating redistribution after death or severe injury. The location implied an attempt at shelter, yet the injuries observed there were markedly different from those found earlier, complicating any unified narrative of escape or collapse. Medical examinations conducted in the weeks that followed documented injuries that were simultaneously specific, severe, and difficult to reconcile with the surrounding terrain. Several victims had fractured ribs or skull damage consistent with high-impact force, while external wounds were minimal or absent. One individual was missing a tongue and soft tissue, a detail later attributed to post-mortem environmental factors, but never fully settled in public perception. Official conclusions cited hypothermia as the cause of death for some, trauma for others, without identifying a single initiating event that accounted for all findings. Despite the growing list of anomalies, the official investigation moved toward closure with language that acknowledged an unknown force without attempting to define it. The case was formally closed in May 1959, stating that the hikers had died due to a compelling natural force they were unable to overcome. Certain materials, including photographs and witness statements, remained classified for decades, contributing to suspicion even as no direct evidence of criminal involvement was ever established. The phrasing resolved administrative necessity while leaving the core question untouched. Long after the case was sealed, the mountain pass itself remained unchanged, shaped by wind patterns and snowfall that erased traces almost as quickly as they appeared. The name Kholat-Syakhl, translated from the Mansi language as Dead Mountain, gained retrospective attention, though there is no evidence that local inhabitants were involved or feared the area in the way later myths suggested. Scientific re-evaluations over the years proposed explanations ranging from slab avalanches to infrasound effects, each addressing parts of the evidence while leaving others unexplained. The terrain continued to resist a single narrative, absorbing theories without confirming any. What continues to unsettle researchers is not the lack of evidence, but the way every confirmed fact seems to resist alignment with the next. The timeline is unusually complete, the participants well documented, and the environment mapped in detail, yet no reconstruction fully accounts for the urgency implied by the tent cuts and the dispersal of the group. The Dyatlov Pass incident persists because it occupies a narrow space between chaos and order, where preparation met sudden abandonment and left behind answers that appear close but never converge. All that is missing from the Dyatlov Pass is not proof, but a reason that can make sense of why 9 capable hikers abandoned certainty in the dark and never reclaimed it. The Lost Patrol of the Canadian Arctic, 1910. Assigned as a matter of routine rather than urgency, a small Royal Northwest Mounted Police Patrol departed into the Canadian Arctic in 1910 on a journey that would later be understood as one from which none of its members returned. The mission was framed as a practical exercise in presence, intended to demonstrate government authority across vast northern territories rather than to confront extraordinary danger. Under the command of Inspector Francis Fitzgerald, the patrol was tasked with travelling from Fort McPherson to Fort Norman, a distance that officials believed could be managed by trained men following established routes. At the outset, there was little indication that this expedition would join the record of wilderness journeys that dissolved quietly into the Arctic. At the centre of the patrol's planning stood an assumption of competence, reinforced by rank, experience, and the belief that discipline itself could offset environmental uncertainty. Fitzgerald had previously served in northern posts, and his leadership was meant to embody reliability rather than innovation. The men under his command, including Constable Edgar Carter and Constable Richard Taylor, were expected to follow instructions precisely and trust in the structure that governed their movements. Their orders reflected confidence in preparation, with little emphasis on flexibility beyond what was already standard for northern patrols. On paper, the route appeared manageable, its distances calculated through reports and charts that reduced the Arctic interior to lines and annotations. The patrol planned to rely on caches placed along the way and on guidance from local knowledge, though the extent to which that knowledge would be accessible in winter was uncertain. Official documents treated the journey as a continuation of established travel, despite seasonal differences that altered the landscape dramatically. What was abstractly navigable in administrative planning would soon confront physical realities that maps could not convey. Conditions on the ground began to diverge from expectation, not through sudden catastrophe, but through accumulating strain imposed by cold, terrain, and limited mobility. Winter temperatures dropped well below what the patrol had previously encountered, slowing progress and increasing the demand on supplies. The men travelled on snowshoes, hauling sleds across terrain where landmarks disappeared beneath snow and ice. Each day required decisions that gradually eroded margins of safety, though no single choice appeared immediately disastrous. Because absence was an accepted feature of northern service, the lack of timely updates did not immediately provoke concern among superiors. Communication from remote patrols was infrequent by design, and delays were often attributed to weather or logistical complications. Weeks passed without word, yet the expectation persisted that the patrol would arrive at Fort Norman as planned. This institutional patience, rooted in routine, allowed the disappearance to unfold without immediate intervention. Only later, when return deadlines had passed without explanation, did efforts begin to reconstruct the patrol's movements from what little evidence remained. Search parties were eventually dispatched, tracing likely routes and examining known stopping points. What they found were signs of prolonged struggle rather than sudden disaster, including abandoned camps and indications that supplies had run low. The reconstruction relied heavily on inference, as no journals or direct accounts were ever recovered. Recovered camps and scattered remains offered fragments of a story that unfolded without witnesses and resisted any simple sequence. One member of the patrol was found near a cache, while others lay further along the route, separated by a distance that suggested staggered collapse rather than a single fatal event. Clothing and equipment indicated attempts to redistribute resources as conditions worsened. The Arctic preserved these scenes in silence, offering evidence without explanation. As official interpretations developed, early confidence gave way to cautious acknowledgement that earlier assumptions had been fatally misplaced. Investigators concluded that the patrol had missed key supply points and underestimated the severity of winter conditions. Decisions that might have been survivable in milder seasons became lethal when combined with exhaustion and isolation. The findings did not assign blame in a conventional sense, instead revealing how institutional certainty can obscure emerging danger. Beyond the immediate loss, the disappearance exposed weaknesses in how authority extended itself into regions it barely understood. The patrol was meant to symbolize control and order, yet its failure highlighted the limits of administrative planning when confronted with extreme environments. The case prompted changes in how northern patrols were conducted, including greater reliance on local guidance and seasonal timing. These reforms came too late for the men who had already vanished into the Arctic interior. In this case, the Arctic functioned less as an adversary than as a neutral force indifferent to planning documents and institutional confidence. It did not deceive or ambush, but simply imposed conditions that demanded adaptation beyond what the patrol's mandate allowed. The environment responded only to physical realities, not to authority or intent. Against this indifference, routine became vulnerability. What ultimately unsettles the record is how long the patrol continued under the logic of orders while the conditions for survival quietly eroded. There was no single moment of realization preserved in the historical record, no decisive turning point captured in writing. The men advanced because the system expected them to advance, even as the path narrowed and options diminished. Their disappearance unfolded through persistence rather than panic. The Lost Patrol did not vanish in a single moment, but followed its mandate step by step into a landscape where procedure offered no protection once endurance ran out. Percy Fawcett's Amazon Expedition, 1925. Percy Fawcett stepped into the dense, humid Amazon, a small expedition trailing behind him, embarking in 1925 on a journey that would vanish completely, leaving only hints of routes traced in maps and the occasional letter sent home. The air was thick with moisture and the scent of vegetation, and already the forest seemed to swallow sound and distance alike, a living presence that demanded respect. Fawcett moved with measured purpose, checking supplies, consulting maps, and confirming the path with local guides, yet every step carried the weight of uncertainty. The expedition was ambitious but grounded in careful planning, and the shadow of the unknown stretched far beyond any charted river or trail. Well before entering the forest, Fawcett had earned a reputation as a meticulous surveyor and explorer, convinced that lost civilizations might lie hidden along uncharted rivers and in isolated valleys. He had mapped regions of Brazil and Bolivia, corresponding with local authorities, scientists, and fellow explorers, each report reflecting a combination of empirical observation and personal conviction. His focus on a legendary city, which he called Z, consumed his planning and drove his meticulous attention to detail. Colleagues regarded him as audacious yet disciplined, and his writings reveal a man whose belief in discovery was inseparable from his understanding of geography and human history. A handful of trusted companions and local guides followed, chosen for their skill in navigating waterways, carrying supplies, and interpreting the rhythms of a jungle that would dominate every movement. Among them were men familiar with the rivers and forests, capable of reading subtle environmental signs and adjusting travel plans when necessary. Supplies included provisions for months, navigational instruments, and equipment for establishing temporary camps along the way. Despite this preparation, the jungle's scale demanded constant vigilance. Every stream, dense thicket, and shifting riverbank could alter schedules or threaten progress. Fawcett relied on both human skill and his own experience to maintain order within the ever-changing environment. From the first days beneath the canopy, the Amazon imposed itself with oppressive humidity, torrential rain, and an unrelenting tangle of vines and undergrowth that slowed progress and tested endurance. The men encountered rivers rising faster than expected, mud that clung and exhausted their legs, and the constant hum of insects and distant animal calls. The heat and dampness seeped into clothing and gear, creating discomfort that could not be fully alleviated, and small injuries or illnesses could escalate quickly. Each day required negotiation with the terrain, careful measurement of effort against risk, and constant attention to navigation through a living, shifting landscape. Rivers traced on maps guided the early stages of the expedition, yet each bend and tributary revealed new challenges. Sudden rapids, shifting banks, and a ceaseless array of wildlife that reminded the team they were intruders in a vast living landscape. Canoes were overturned, sleds dragged, and paths blocked by fallen trees or vegetation too dense to penetrate easily. Fawcett's journals record these obstacles matter-of-factly, often noting the skill required to overcome them without embellishment, yet the accumulation of delays added stress and demanded constant recalibration. Progress was slow but methodical, a reflection of both discipline and respect for the jungle's power. Fatigue and tropical illness began to sap strength as weeks passed, while Fawcett's unwavering focus on discovering the city he called Z shaped every decision, pushing the expedition ever deeper into uncharted terrain. Malaria, dysentery and fevers emerged among the men, symptoms recorded by Fawcett in notes that described treatment and recovery efforts. Decisions about routes and rest periods increasingly reflected his obsession rather than objective calculation, and the team's reliance on his judgment became more critical with every setback. Yet no contemporary accounts suggest panic. The expedition pressed forward with the same determination that had launched it, even as conditions became progressively harsher. Letters sent to family and colleagues, along with the few sightings recorded at frontier settlements, provide the last confirmed glimpses of the expedition's progress, leaving large gaps in the timeline that have never been resolved. One final correspondence mentions navigating the Xingu River and preparing to explore an area reportedly rich with archaeological potential, but the exact locations, routes and outcomes remain undocumented. These fragmentary accounts highlight the difficulty of tracking individuals in a landscape as vast and mutable as the Amazon, and they underscore how quickly certainty gave way to speculation once the men ceased to return as expected. Indigenous communities later recounted fleeting encounters with outsiders travelling along remote rivers, but their testimony offered no clarity, only fleeting impressions that the party persisted in regions rarely visited by strangers. Hunters, fishers and traders described seeing men matching the expedition's description, moving cautiously, carrying gear and travelling in small groups, yet the accounts were inconsistent and sparse. These observations suggest that the expedition may have survived longer than official records indicate, but without corroborating evidence, the details cannot be verified. The forest itself, ever present and mutable, preserved no record of time or distance that could be reconciled with these fragments. Initial searches conducted by Brazilian authorities and private expeditions struggled against the jungle's scale and complexity, recovering little beyond abandoned campsites and scattered items that confirmed passage but not fate. Equipment, utensils and personal effects were found in locations consistent with travel and prolonged habitation, but no bodies or definitive conclusions were uncovered. Explorers noted how rivers and sudden storms had likely swept away camps or obscured trails, and how the density of vegetation could conceal even larger traces indefinitely. Every search underscored the limits of human observation against an environment that erased its own history. The Amazon itself emerged as the dominant presence. Rivers shifted course, forests closed behind the explorers, and storms erased paths, asserting the environment's authority over a journey guided solely by human determination. Unlike ice or snow, the jungle actively transformed and reclaimed the spaces the expedition passed through, leaving ephemeral signs of travel that vanished with wind, rain, or animal activity. Fawcett's maps, while precise in measurement and recording, could not capture this fluidity, and every attempt to follow in his footsteps confronted terrain that had already rewritten itself. The wilderness was both constant and unknowable, a living maze beyond full human control. Decades later, Fawcett's disappearance continues to captivate because it embodies the intersection of ambition, isolation, and a wilderness that absorbs every step without record or witness. Scholars, adventurers, and enthusiasts have retraced likely routes, analysed letters, and compared indigenous accounts, yet no consensus has emerged. The mystery remains unresolved, not for lack of effort, but because the scale, density, and unpredictability of the Amazon forest render certainty impossible. Fawcett's journey serves as a testament to both human curiosity and the limits imposed by nature itself, a disappearance that is remarkable precisely for its elusiveness. What remains of Fawcett's journey is the shadow of paths he mapped but never returned to follow. The Greely Arctic Expedition, 1881. A sense of cautious optimism marked the departure of Adolphus Greely's expedition as it sailed into the unforgiving Arctic, a journey in 1881 that would test every assumption about endurance and ultimately claim the lives of most who embarked. The crew, composed of 25 men selected for experience and discipline, boarded the USS Proteus and sailed northward along the jagged coastline, where icebergs drifted silently jagged and unyielding. Each day presented a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Scientific instruments were double-checked, provisions accounted for, and maps scrutinized against reports from earlier expeditions. Yet even in these early hours, the vast silence of the Arctic hinted that the region would dictate terms the explorers had not fully anticipated. Greely himself, experienced yet exacting, had meticulously planned for months, assembling men, instruments, and provisions intended to carry them safely into a region known for both its scientific potential and its lethal unpredictability. His instructions were precise, emphasizing discipline, routine, and meticulous record-keeping. Instruments for meteorological and astronomical observation were stowed carefully, alongside sleds, tents, and food stores intended to last multiple months. Each member of the party understood the stakes. Survival required not only skill but careful adherence to protocol. Greely's confidence was rooted in preparation and knowledge, yet even he could not fully measure the Arctic's capacity for relentless challenge. The landing site became the first confrontation with the Arctic's authority. Icebound coasts, shifting flows, and relentless winds challenged the party even before inland progress could begin. Disembarkation onto frozen terrain demanded care, as the men manoeuvred sleds and supplies across thin ice and snow-laden shores. Gusts of wind cut through layers of clothing, and temperatures near -30 degrees Fahrenheit reminded every member that the environment tolerated no lapse in attention. As the first structures were erected for the base camp, it became evident that the Arctic was not a neutral stage for human activity, but a force in its own right, imposing both physical and psychological constraints from the outset. As the weeks unfolded, the ice drifted unpredictably, forcing constant adjustments to sled routes, supply depots, and observation posts, while reminding the men that nature was indifferent to their schedules or rank. Expeditions to lay depots were delayed by pressure ridges and shifting snowfields, and the landscape itself appeared to move beneath their feet. Greely's journals described the continuous recalibration of tasks as men struggled to maintain communication with the distant points and to navigate the treacherous terrain. Even when progress was made, the Arctic reshaped it almost immediately, demonstrating an authority beyond human control or comprehension. Winter's grip tightened with a gradual but unrelenting cruelty, freezing stores, crippling movement, and demanding rationing that would soon blur the line between caution and desperation. Measured portions of pemmican and dried meats became the norm, and every morsel was carefully weighed against projected needs. Temperatures plunged further, and exposure combined with malnutrition to erode both strength and morale. Clothing, though layered, often became damp from condensation, accelerating frostbite and hypothermia. Each day was a negotiation between effort and survival, with even routine activities requiring careful calculation to prevent disaster. The psychological strain of isolation revealed itself in subtle ways: whispered disagreements, mounting fatigue, and a constant awareness that each day could bring disaster beyond calculation. Men spent long hours observing ice conditions or performing meteorological readings, yet each routine task carried the weight of necessity. Sleep came fitfully, with frost creeping into the edges of canvas shelters, and the Arctic silence amplified every creak, groan, or distant crack of ice. Greely himself maintained discipline and structure, yet his journals hint at the quiet tension mounting among the men as the season pressed forward and the supply line remained tenuous. Relief ships arrived later than expected, hampered by shifting ice and miscommunication, leaving the men to endure a suspenseful limbo where hope and uncertainty coexisted with relentless cold. The USS Thetis and later the Proteus attempted resupply missions, but shifting ice flows blocked passages and delayed planned departures. From the camp, distant signals of arrival or the sound of approaching vessels were often obscured, leaving the men dependent on ration stores and their own resourcefulness. Each failed arrival intensified the sense of isolation, and the Arctic's indifference became more palpable with every missed opportunity for relief. Retreats southward or consolidation at their base became necessary as hunger, frostbite, and illness gradually sapped strength, each decision a balance between survival and exposure to further danger. Sled teams carried reduced loads along increasingly treacherous ice, and tents were repositioned to avoid unstable snowdrifts. Some men could no longer perform routine tasks without assistance, and each step became a negotiation with the environment itself. Greely recorded the exact positioning of depots and shelters, noting their diminishing capacity to sustain human life, while the relentless Arctic elements slowly closed in on every route and decision. Gradually, the expedition fractured under the strain, individuals succumbed to the cold and starvation, while journals and records later recovered painted a picture of endurance tested to the very edge of possibility. Frostbite, malnutrition and scurvy claimed lives even among the most experienced men, and the pace of survival slowed to a grim sequence of day-to-day endurance. Yet the meticulous records of food usage, temperatures and travel distances offer insight into the calculated decisions made in extremis. Every loss was documented, every movement logged, creating a record that survives as testimony to both human determination and environmental indifference. Beyond the human toll, the expedition left a legacy of maps, meteorological observations, and insights into Arctic conditions that could only be gathered by men who endured what the ice demanded. Despite the tragedy, scientific measurements of wind patterns, ice movement, and astronomical observations enriched knowledge of the high Arctic. Factual accounts of the terrain, the distribution of ice flows, and the conditions of winter camps contributed to a more accurate understanding of survival logistics. These achievements, however, are inseparable from the story of extreme human endurance and loss that shadowed every observation and map. Even decades later, Greely's expedition is remembered not merely for its loss of life, but for the way the Arctic absorbed their progress, leaving behind fragments that hint at perseverance and the limits of human endeavour. Accounts of recovered artefacts, preserved journals, and skeletal remains provide only partial answers, and the precise day-to-day struggle within the frozen landscape remains incompletely documented. The expedition endures as both a cautionary tale and a testament to meticulous planning confronted by nature's overwhelming force, illustrating how even preparation can falter under conditions that are fundamentally unforgiving. The ice held their story in silence, revealing only fragments of a struggle that no record could entirely capture. The Nanda Devi tragedy, 1965. Above the jagged ridges of the Nanda Devi Massif, a combined Indo-American team prepared in 1965 for an ascent that would end in tragedy and leave the mountain's higher slopes shrouded in unanswered questions. The climbers were drawn to the peak not only for its towering prominence, reaching 7,816 metres, but also for the challenge posed by its glaciers, ice cliffs, and notoriously unpredictable weather. From base camp in the valley below, the team surveyed the surrounding ridges and snowfields, noting the most plausible route for ascent, while the mountain itself loomed like a silent arbiter of their ambition. Though spirits were high and plans meticulous, the expedition would soon encounter conditions that no preparation could fully anticipate. The climbers, selected for experience and physical endurance, carried oxygen, ropes and provisions carefully measured for high-altitude survival, their meticulous planning reflecting both ambition and awareness of the Himalayan dangers. Names such as Colonel Narendra and American mountaineer Charlie Houston were central to the team, bringing a combination of military precision and climbing expertise to the endeavour. Each rope, carabiner and ice axe was inspected repeatedly, every ration and fuel container weighed, and every tent pitch rehearsed. Yet even this attention to detail could not account for the mountain's capacity to isolate, disorient, and ultimately consume. Early days on the glaciers tested every skill. Crevasses yawned unpredictably, snowfields shifted underfoot, and icy wind gusts cut through layers of clothing, reminding the expedition that the mountain tolerated no error. Camp placements were carefully chosen near natural windbreaks or rocky outcrops, and travel between depots demanded constant vigilance. The sound of shifting ice, distant avalanches, and the roar of wind through the peaks underscored the omnipresence of risk, while subtle visual cues, the texture of snow, the angle of slopes, and the appearance of seracs, required constant attention to prevent disaster. Technical challenges multiplied as the team confronted seracs, rock faces, and avalanche-prone slopes, forcing constant decisions about routes, loads, and acclimatization to preserve strength while advancing toward their goal. Each stage of the ascent was meticulously timed, with climbers alternating between carrying loads and scouting ahead. Ice axes dug into frozen surfaces, pitons were driven into hard rock, and every anchor point was checked multiple times, yet the mountain's inherent instability meant that even careful work could not guarantee security. The men were acutely aware that a single misstep could trigger a slide, collapse a snow bridge, or leave a climber stranded hundreds of meters above the next safe ledge. Storms arrived with little warning, bringing blinding snow and sub-zero temperatures that slowed movement, strained equipment, and eroded morale, while the mountain's scale rendered each day a negotiation with forces beyond human control. Tents had to be reinforced continuously, fuel for stoves rationed to maintain both warmth and the ability to melt snow for water, and every task, from checking ropes to distributing food, became physically punishing. Visibility often fell to mere meters, forcing climbers to rely on memory, compasses, and faint markers in the snow. Each gust and flurry reminded the team that the mountain dictated pace, shelter, and even survival. The final recorded positions of the climbers, noted in logbooks and radio transmissions, offer only fragmented clues, leaving the exact moment and cause of their disappearance a mystery that has endured for decades. Communications relayed that the summit push was underway, with weather seemingly manageable, yet subsequent attempts to contact the team failed. Camps were later found abandoned, supplies untouched in some cases, while personal items left behind hinted at sudden decisions or forced retreats. No direct account explains the circumstances, and the partial record feeds the enduring uncertainty that surrounds the expedition. Search efforts began almost immediately, with teams navigating treacherous icefalls, altitude sickness, and unpredictable weather, yet found little more than abandoned tents, oxygen bottles, and traces of footprints swallowed quickly by drifting snow. Indian authorities coordinated with mountaineering specialists, but every day lost visibility, and the dynamic glacial environment erased evidence faster than it could be recorded. Crevasses concealed possible passages, snowfalls obliterated tracks, and ice walls impeded access to higher camps, leaving rescuers with only fragments of what might have occurred and heightening the sense of incompleteness and suspense. Subsequent expeditions, years later, recovered scattered artifacts and occasional human remains, but each discovery answered few questions and reinforced the sense that the mountain had claimed the climbers entirely. Items such as climbing ropes, oxygen cylinders, and a few personal belongings surfaced amid ice or were carried away by glacial movement, hinting at progress but never confirming fate. Even where remains were discovered, the harsh conditions of high altitude meant that precise causes of death or the sequence of events could rarely be determined. The mountain, in effect, preserved only fragments of a story that would never be fully told. Avalanches, hidden crevasses, and shifting snowfields illustrated the formidable and indifferent power of Nanda Devi, a wilderness that allowed only fleeting evidence of human passage and erased almost all trace of its visitors. Expeditions attempting to reach higher camps reported icefalls that had shifted significantly since the climbers' departure, and rock slides had altered slopes near previously mapped routes. The constant movement of glaciers and accumulation of fresh snow ensured that footprints, gear, and even structures left behind were temporary at best, emphasizing the ephemeral and fragile nature of human presence at extreme altitude. The tragedy contributed to mountaineering knowledge, including high-altitude logistics, weather preparedness, and team coordination, yet the human cost remains inseparable from the lessons recorded in the mountain's silent corridors. Future expeditions benefited from more cautious acclimatization schedules, reinforced camps, and improved communications, but the psychological impact of the Nanda Devi disappearance lingered in mountaineering communities. Guides and climbers became acutely aware that even meticulous planning could be overwhelmed by environmental forces, and that mountains with towering, isolated faces demand both respect and humility. Time has done little to resolve the mystery. Maps, reports, and recovered fragments hinted events, but the expedition's fate is preserved chiefly in unanswered questions and the imposing stillness of the Himalayan heights. Every new photograph, each ice core, and even anecdotal accounts of avalanches remind those who study the mountain that the Nanda Devi Massif remains a place of active danger. The expedition, though partially documented, ultimately demonstrates how human endeavour is measured against a scale of nature that is vast, indifferent, and occasionally lethal. The peaks of Nanda Devi keep their secrets locked in ice and snow, offering only whispers of the climber's last journey. The Siberian Anabarskaya tragedy 1973. A pale sun barely pierced the frozen horizon of the Anabarskaya river basin as the 1973 expedition embarked, venturing into a Siberian wilderness that would ultimately swallow them without a trace. The terrain was a stark expanse of snowfields, ice-bound rivers, and taiga forest patches, a place so remote that maps offered only rough approximations of its course. From the very start, the expedition confronted a world defined by scale and silence, where the wind carved paths through the snow, and every shadow could hide either danger or impossibility. The sense of isolation was immediate. Even the closest settlements were days of travel away, and the harsh winter meant that human presence was fleeting in a land dominated by frozen rivers and drifting snow. The team consisted of geologists, hydrologists, and navigators, each equipped with sledges, small motorboats, and provisions calculated for weeks of isolation amid the harsh tundra. Their expertise varied, but every member understood the unforgiving conditions that lay ahead, and every piece of equipment, from insulated tents to portable stoves, was critical to survival. Supplies had been rationed meticulously, yet the sheer weight of survival in temperatures dropping below -30°C imposed a strain that went beyond planning. Even the simplest tasks, like breaking through river ice or hauling sledges over snowdrifts, required endurance, coordination, and a constant awareness of both environment and human limitation. Rivers iced over in unpredictable patterns, while snow-laden plains stretched endlessly, testing the expedition's skill and resolve from the very first days of travel. Navigating the Anabarskaya's frozen channels demanded a mix of patience and calculated risk. Thin ice could collapse under the weight of a sledge or a team of men, while hidden crevasses threatened sudden disaster. Trees, sparse and bent by relentless wind, offered meagre shelter, and each step forward was measured not only against distance but against the invisible hazards of an environment that could not be tamed. The cold pressed into every layer of clothing, a constant reminder that human endurance had limits even in the best prepared parties. Blizzards and sudden thaw cycles transformed familiar routes into treacherous traps, and the occasional presence of wolves and bears reminded the party that survival depended on constant vigilance. One morning, tracks of a lone wolf near the camp stirred unease among the team, a stark illustration of the predators that shared this frozen wilderness. Snowdrifts could conceal dangerous hollows or mislead compass readings, while sudden thaws made river crossings unpredictable, forcing adjustments to the expedition's carefully laid plans. Each environmental twist underscored the tenuous balance between human determination and natural authority. Mechanical failures and supply shortages soon compounded the challenges of distance and cold, and fatigue began to erode both morale and the precision necessary for navigation. Sledges broke under weight, small motorboats struggled against partial ice, and rationed food supplies dwindled more quickly than anticipated. Fatigue made judgment slow, and every decision, choosing a river crossing, setting up a camp or dividing loads, carried higher stakes. Even minor errors became amplified in a landscape where the margin for recovery was almost non-existent, and the team confronted the quiet realization that their survival depended as much on fortune as on skill. The last radio transmissions offered glimpses of their position along the frozen rivers, yet these fragments quickly faded into silence, leaving their fate uncertain. Reports indicated progress toward a mapped research point, but the clarity of information was quickly lost to the tundra's immense scale. Subsequent attempts at communication were met with static and interruptions, leaving planners and relatives alike in suspense, uncertain whether a misstep, environmental hazard, or equipment failure had stopped the expedition. The sparse record of these transmissions would become a central piece of the mystery surrounding the team's disappearance. Rescue teams deployed helicopters, dog sleds, and river patrols, yet shifting ice and persistent storms hindered every attempt to locate the missing group. Each search mission faced the same environmental antagonists as the original expedition: snowdrifts that covered tracks, rivers that broke apart unpredictably, and temperatures that threatened both human and mechanical endurance. Helicopters could only reach certain points before wind and icing forced a retreat, and dog sled teams risked falling through thin ice. Days passed, then weeks, and the land gradually reclaimed all evidence of human passage. Abandoned camps, scattered sledges, and partial supplies hinted at movement and struggle, but no definitive trail emerged from the vast white expanse of the tundra. Tents left behind suggested attempts to wait out the weather, while equipment placed carelessly hinted at sudden unplanned departures. Sledges found along riverbanks implied progress that may have ended abruptly, yet no bodies or survivors were located within reasonable search zones. The fragmentary nature of these clues reinforced the sense of incompleteness, leaving every discovery as much a question as it was an answer. The Siberian wilderness asserted itself relentlessly, with shifting river ice, snow accumulation and dense forests erasing every trace of human passage within days. Even precise map coordinates proved of little help when ice drifted, snow-buried camps and rivers altered their course. The landscape itself became a kind of silent character in the story, one that actively obscured evidence and left the human element vulnerable to the smallest miscalculation. In this environment, survival hinged on both preparation and chance, and the tundra seemed almost to guard the fate of those who dared traverse it. Despite the loss, the expedition left behind survey data, hydrological measurements, and climatology records that contributed to scientific understanding of one of the world's most remote regions. Their work provided insights into river flow, permafrost distribution, and winter navigation techniques that informed future explorations and safety protocols. Yet, the cost of these contributions was starkly human. A small group of trained specialists vanished entirely, leaving behind only fragmentary evidence and the enduring weight of unanswered questions. The legacy of their measurements exists alongside the haunting reminder of what the tundra can claim. Time has passed, but the fate of the Anabarskaya expedition remains unresolved, a stark reminder that even meticulous planning and experience cannot overcome Siberia's extreme isolation. Maps, reports, and artifacts scattered across the landscape provide only glimpses of what transpired, leaving the story incomplete and enigmatic. Observers can piece together movements and probable hazards, yet the precise circumstances that led to the disappearance remain a mystery that the tundra has refused to yield. The human presence in this frozen wilderness is fleeting, measured in footprints quickly swallowed by wind and snow. The Anabarskaya tundra conceals their journey beneath frozen rivers and drifting snow, offering only fleeting hints of the path they once traversed. The Darien Gap Expedition, 1879. Thick, humid air clung to every surface as the 1879 expedition entered the Darien Gap, a labyrinth of swamps, rivers, and dense jungle that would soon conceal the team from the world. The explorers faced a landscape so inhospitable that even the least progress required extraordinary effort, and the oppressive heat and constant moisture made every task a trial of endurance. Trees draped in lianas blocked sightlines, while pools of stagnant water bred clouds of mosquitoes that carried the threat of disease. From the outset, the expedition was challenged not by a single hazard, but by a relentless combination of terrain, climate, and isolation that left little room for error. Every step forward was measured in meters, every camp a temporary foothold in a region that seemed to actively resist human presence. The group consisted of surveyors, naturalists, and local guides, armed with machetes, canvas tents, and small canoes, prepared to traverse one of the most impenetrable regions in Central America. Their mission was ambitious: to chart unknown rivers, observe local flora and fauna, and record geographical features that had never been formally documented. Despite careful planning, the limitations of 19th century equipment and the unpredictability of the jungle meant that even minor miscalculations could become serious setbacks. The explorers relied on local knowledge for navigation, but the Darien Gap's intricate network of waterways and dense vegetation turned every decision into a test of judgment and stamina. The first days were spent hacking through tangled vegetation and sinking into waterlogged soil, where each step required extraordinary effort and every progress was measured in meters rather than miles. Riverbanks proved unstable, and canoes frequently grounded or capsized in shallow channels. Trails marked with crude blazes disappeared quickly as vines, mud, and creeping water swallowed evidence of passage. The physical labour drained the expedition faster than they had anticipated, while the constant exposure to humidity and heat left clothes soaked and supplies damp, making even basic tasks such as cooking or tent setup a daily ordeal. Biting insects, venomous snakes, and the relentless presence of tropical disease tested both body and mind, and the oppressive humidity weighed heavily on every member of the team. Fever and fatigue swept through the group in waves, and the constant gnawing of mosquitoes left sores and infections that slowed progress. At night, the dense jungle amplified the sounds of wildlife, making rest difficult and instilling a sense of vulnerability as shadows of unknown creatures moved just beyond the light of campfires. The mental toll of isolation compounded the physical strain, and each day's march felt increasingly precarious against the invisible hazards surrounding them. Food supplies dwindled faster than anticipated, while rivers proved unpredictable and campsites were often flooded or overrun by the encroaching jungle, creating tension and exhaustion. The team rationed carefully, but swampy terrain made hunting and foraging difficult, and attempts to collect fresh water were frequently thwarted by contaminated sources. Equipment suffered from constant moisture, tents weakened, canoes required repairs, and stores of preserved food spoiled more quickly than expected. Exhaustion and hunger eroded morale, leading to disagreements over route choices, campsite selection, and pacing, a fragile equilibrium that the jungle seemed poised to shatter. Partial journal entries and notes left by the explorers revealed fleeting glimpses of their route, hinting at cautious optimism and moments of frustration amid the relentless terrain. Sketches of river bends, descriptions of dense mangroves, and observations of wildlife provide tantalizing fragments of their experience. Yet these documents end abruptly, leaving the outcome unknown. The records convey both the meticulous care taken to navigate the landscape and the gradual encroachment of desperation as the expedition struggled to maintain momentum in a setting designed to frustrate human effort. Scattered belongings and abandoned gear suggested that the team had been forced to move quickly or retreat, yet no further human traces were ever conclusively found. Empty tents, damp journals, and overturned canoes hinted at hurried decisions and unanticipated dangers, but could not reveal whether illness, accident, or exhaustion had brought the expedition to its end. Local accounts reported occasional sightings of distant figures moving through the undergrowth, yet no rescuer was able to approach or confirm these encounters, leaving speculation to fill the void left by missing records. Attempts to locate the missing expedition were hampered by the dense jungle, swollen rivers, and remote location, leaving searches largely unsuccessful and often dangerous for those who tried. Explorers, guides, and local authorities mounted rescue efforts over the following months, but thick vegetation and impassable terrain prevented systematic coverage. Search parties occasionally stumbled upon abandoned items or footprints that dissolved into the mud, yet no living team members were recovered. The Darien Gap's combination of climatic extremes, topographical complexity, and remoteness made any attempt at reconstruction of the expedition's route a near impossible task. Within weeks, the landscape reclaimed paths, campsites, and evidence, with vines, moss, and creeping vegetation erasing nearly every sign of human passage. Channels filled with rainwater, tree roots closed over footprints, and fallen branches covered abandoned supplies. The jungle acted almost like a living archive, absorbing and obscuring the presence of humans within days, leaving only faint traces that hinted at effort but could not convey the story of survival or demise. In this setting, even the most careful documentation or deliberate marking of routes proved ephemeral, a reminder of the impermanence of human endeavour in the face of the natural world. Though the expedition contributed rudimentary mapping and biological observations of the region, the human cost overshadowed any scientific achievement, leaving the journey both instructive and tragic. Observations of river systems, plant life, and soil types would later inform other expeditions, yet they were recorded in fragments and frequently lost to the jungle's dampness. The story of the team's disappearance became a cautionary tale for future explorers, highlighting the dangers inherent in attempting to traverse an area where the environment actively resists human incursion. Even now, the fate of the explorers remains unknown, a chilling reminder of the unforgiving and isolated nature of the Darien Gap. Speculation and investigation continue to fill gaps in the historical record, yet the jungle itself preserves its secrets, concealing every misstep, every camp, and every fragment of the expedition's final journey. The land that challenged the team in life continues to guard the truth of their disappearance, leaving observers with only questions that cannot yet be answered. The jungle shelters hidden knowledge beneath its ever-shifting canopy, offering only faint whispers of the vanished expedition, the Rhoads-Murphy Alaska expedition, 1906. Preparations had taken months, yet even with careful planning, Rhoads and Murphy could not foresee the isolation and danger that awaited them deep within Alaska's uncharted forests and glaciers. Supplies were meticulously packed, equipment inspected, and every conceivable contingency considered, yet the vastness of the subarctic wilderness rendered even the most careful planning fragile. From the first step into the dense spruce forests, they were reminded that human presence in such remote regions could be measured not by distance travelled, but by endurance against unseen hazards. The roar of distant glaciers, the call of far-off wildlife, and the constant chill in the air hinted at an environment that would test every skill and resolve. Even as the explorers pressed forward, there was a sense that the land itself was indifferent to human ambition, and that any misstep could become permanent. Their team was small but determined, relying on basic camping gear, surveying tools, and a few navigational charts that promised routes through rivers and glaciers, largely untouched by outsiders. The expedition aimed to map unknown tributaries, observe geological features, and document wildlife in a region that few had traversed. Each member brought a combination of enthusiasm and inexperience, their courage bolstered by optimism but tempered by the acknowledgement that they were entering a landscape as challenging as it was remote. The limited size of the team meant both efficiency and vulnerability, fewer hands to carry loads and repair equipment, but also fewer eyes to watch for danger. In the first days of travel, progress was slow. Tangled underbrush, unstable riverbanks, and unseen obstacles forced them to improvise and constantly reassess their route. Every step through dense forest required the constant swinging of machetes, careful probing of soft soil, and attention to the hidden roots and moss-covered rocks that could easily betray a misstep. The rivers, swollen by snowmelt, frequently obstructed passage, and makeshift crossings demanded precise judgment or risked being swept away. Fatigue accumulated quickly, and each day ended with damp clothes, sore muscles, and the uneasy realization that the forest absorbed and erased every trace of their passage. Glaciers loomed in the distance, their crevasses hidden beneath thin snow, while icy rivers surged unpredictably, demanding caution and exhausting every ounce of strength. The explorers learned to gauge the firmness of the ice with tentative steps and probing poles, aware that one false measure could result in a fall that would trap them far from help. Rivers that appeared shallow could conceal powerful currents, carrying debris and threatening equipment, while sudden snow squalls reduced visibility to mere feet. The landscape itself was a challenge that required constant negotiation, as solid ground was rare and the margin for error minimal. Encounters with wildlife reminded them of their vulnerability. The sudden snap of a branch signaled the presence of bears, while distant howls of wolves echoed through the trees, unseen but threatening. Moose occasionally emerged from dense stands of spruce, their bulk forcing cautious detours, while smaller creatures like porcupines and lynx added constant interruptions to already exhausting travel. The psychological effect of these encounters weighed heavily. Even harmless wildlife could unsettle sleep, making nights restless, and the continuous sense of being watched compounded the isolation and tension. Limited supplies and the absence of nearby settlements amplified tension as fatigue and hunger began to erode the team's resilience and sharpen the mental strain of isolation. Provisions were carefully rationed, but the harsh environment accelerated consumption, and attempts to supplement with hunting or fishing were often thwarted by weather, inaccessible terrain, or elusive wildlife. Sleep was fitful, disrupted by wind-rattling tents, distant animal calls, and the constant worry of rivers rising overnight. Each day became a negotiation between progress and preservation, with every choice carrying consequences for survival that were both immediate and unknowable. Evidence of the explorers' route came in abandoned campsites, where scattered belongings and partially dismantled tents hinted at sudden movement or an unforeseen emergency. Personal journals left behind, boots soaked through, and overturned stoves suggested hurried departure, yet no direct evidence explained what compelled them to move so urgently. Items left behind indicated care for personal effects, but also a recognition of imminent danger, a tacit acknowledgement that the wilderness could not be negotiated indefinitely on human terms alone. Each campsite told a fragment of a story that would never be fully reconstructed. Letters and brief journal entries revealed determination and glimpses of progress, yet none contained clues to the ultimate fate of the two men, leaving only unanswered questions. Observations recorded about rivers, rock formations and ice conditions demonstrated careful attention to detail, yet ended abruptly, as though the environment itself had interrupted their work. Even the fragments hinted a slow but deliberate attempt to navigate the glaciers and forests, emphasizing both ambition and vulnerability. The abrupt cessation of entries transformed curiosity into unease, as historians and later explorers could only infer the final moments from indirect evidence. Small search parties attempted to follow their trail, navigating dense forests and treacherous rivers, but the terrain and sudden storms thwarted every effort to locate the missing explorers. Canoes were overturned by swift currents, and rescuers struggled through icy bogs and snow-laden passes. Even when partial campsites were found, the men themselves remained absent, leaving only questions about how far they had travelled and whether misfortune, exhaustion, or environmental hazards had claimed them. The subarctic wilderness revealed its indifference once more, showing that discovery in these regions often came at the expense of human presence itself. Recovered observations and rudimentary maps offered minor contributions to knowledge of the region, yet the human loss cast a long shadow over any scientific accomplishment. Notes on river bends, glacier edges, and wildlife added fragments to Alaskan cartography, but these were overshadowed by the unanswered question of the explorers' survival. Their disappearance served as a cautionary tale for future expeditions, illustrating that even careful preparation, experience, and determination could be rendered insufficient against the unpredictable, remorseless wilderness. Generations have passed without an answer, yet the disappearance of Rhoads-Murphy continues to haunt those who study the subarctic wilderness of Alaska. The story persists in letters, reports, and oral histories, each fragment a reminder of the isolation and danger inherent in a landscape where few humans tread. The combination of dense forest, icy rivers, and glaciers has kept their fate obscured, leaving modern observers to imagine the challenges and decisions that unfolded during their final days. The forests and glaciers harbour hidden stories, leaving only faint echoes where once human footsteps vanished without a trace. The Lykov Encounter Aftermath, 1981. For decades, a family had lived entirely cut off from the outside world, surviving in the depths of the Siberian taiga, where rivers and mountains erased any trace of civilization. Their isolation was absolute, interrupted only by the passing of seasons, the shifting of wildlife, and the quiet rhythm of their daily labour. The land itself seemed to swallow every sound, every footprint, every fragment of human life, leaving the Lykovs to exist in a world largely unchanged since they first settled in the 1930s. When explorers finally encountered them in 1981, the contrast between their solitude and the outside world was immediately striking. A family preserved in near-perfect isolation, as though time itself had moved differently in this remote valley. The Lykovs had retreated into isolation in the 1930s, seeking refuge from religious persecution, and built a life that relied entirely on self-sufficiency and intimate knowledge of the land. The family consisted of Karp, the father, his wife Akulina, and their children, who were raised without contact with modern society. Each member of the household learned survival skills from necessity rather than instruction, shaping a life where every decision was tied directly to sustenance and safety. The forest, the rivers, and the small cultivated plots of rye and vegetables became both home and tutor, teaching lessons in resilience that no outside school could provide. When geologists finally stumbled upon their cabin in 1981, the initial encounter revealed a household preserved in a near-pristine state of solitude, with each object reflecting decades of careful use. The cabin was small, constructed from hand-hewn logs and insulated with moss and bark, its interior meticulously maintained. Pots and pans showed signs of constant repair, while clothing and blankets bore the marks of generations of handwork. Each item told a story of endurance and adaptation, a narrative of human life conducted entirely apart from the developments of the 20th century. The explorers were struck by the quiet efficiency of the household, a system of life honed to perfection by necessity rather than convenience. Daily routines were dictated by the rhythms of the environment. Foraging, hunting, tending small gardens, and maintaining shelters with tools fashioned entirely from natural materials. Meals were simple but sufficient, consisting of roots, grains, dried fish, and whatever small game could be trapped or shot. The children learned to carry water, chop wood, and harvest what the taiga offered, all under the careful supervision of Karp and Akulina. Every day was measured against the need to survive, a constant negotiation between energy expended and resources acquired. The forest dictated the pace, the rivers demanded respect, and even the weather was a teacher, often harsh and unforgiving. Language and communication presented a challenge, as the family's vocabulary had evolved in isolation, incorporating terms and expressions unknown to outsiders and leaving dialogue slow and cautious. Words describing concepts, objects, or experiences foreign to the taiga were absent, and gestures often carried as much meaning as speech. For the geologist, this presented a puzzle. How could a family convey complex ideas when their entire lexicon had been shaped by a single valley and a single way of life? The dialogue revealed both ingenuity and limitation, highlighting how culture can diverge sharply when removed from broader human interaction. Psychological observations became as compelling as the environmental ones, with the explorers noting behaviours, rituals, and survival habits shaped by extreme, uninterrupted isolation. Daily work was punctuated by routines that reinforced both physical endurance and emotional stability. The children displayed remarkable composure and self-sufficiency, while the adults demonstrated profound awareness of their surroundings. Every action, from the maintenance of a trap to the careful rationing of grains, reflected years of practice and a worldview where every element of life had direct consequence. There was a rhythm, an order, that outsiders recognized as extraordinary in its steadiness and necessity. Winter in the taiga imposed relentless hardships, from sub-zero temperatures to snow-laden forests, testing both physical endurance and the family's meticulous knowledge of their surroundings. The Lykovs built shelters capable of withstanding blizzards and insulated their clothing with layers of fur, moss, and fabric. Food had to be stored carefully, often underground or in the cabin loft, protected from both animals and freezing conditions. Each winter became a trial, a test of foresight, skill, and discipline, where failure could lead to starvation or exposure. Yet despite these hazards, the family endured, their lives a quiet testament to adaptation in the most remote environment imaginable. Small interactions with the visitors, exchanges of simple items, questions about the wider world, or demonstrations of skills offered fleeting windows into a life untouched by modern society. The explorers gave matches, notebooks, and simple clothing, while the Lykovs shared knowledge of foraging, hunting, and crafting tools from the forest. Each encounter was measured and deliberate, neither side rushing the other, as if the flow of time in this hidden valley was governed by a different set of rules. These exchanges revealed the fragility of contact. A single conversation could illuminate decades of human ingenuity, yet it also highlighted the chasm separating two entirely different worlds. Documentation collected by the geologists, including sketches, notes, and photographs, provided only a partial understanding, leaving many aspects of the Lykovs' survival and mindset mysterious. Observations recorded the locations of gardens, the construction of shelters, and the techniques used for hunting and fishing, but the meaning behind many practices remained elusive. Even the smallest objects, a carved spoon, a rudimentary tool, a patchwork garment, hinted at skill and adaptation that no outsider could fully interpret. These fragments were tantalizing evidence of resilience, yet they could not convey the full complexity of a life spent entirely in isolation. Even brief contact altered the delicate balance of their existence, as curiosity, anxiety, and the risk of disease intruded upon a life shaped entirely by isolation. The Lykovs had never encountered outsiders, and each interaction brought both wonder and fear. Their routines were disrupted, their previously predictable environment now tinged with uncertainty. The family's isolation, once absolute, now intersected with the outside world, introducing questions and possibilities that could not be fully addressed within the protective rhythms of the taiga. Years after the first encounter, much about the Lykovs' adaptation to the taiga remains enigmatic, a testament to both human resilience and the relentless remoteness of Siberia. Scholars and explorers continue to study the records, photographs, and objects collected in 1981, but gaps remain. How did this family maintain mental stability? What unwritten practices ensured their survival? Why had the taiga been sufficient to sustain them for decades? Each answer seems only to deepen the mystery, emphasizing the extraordinary nature of their lives and the enduring power of the wilderness. The taiga guards its mysteries in silence, allowing glimpses of a life untouched by time yet impossible to fully comprehend. The Terra Nova Northern Party, 1912. Far from the main Terra Nova expedition, a small party of men pushed into the jagged expanse of northern Victoria Land, tasked with charting a region few had seen and even fewer would endure. The Antarctic landscape stretched like a frozen wilderness without end, glaciers flowing silently into the distant sea and jagged ridges casting sharp shadows over plains of pristine snow. Isolation was immediate and absolute. The Northern Party had no hope of rapid assistance, no nearby shelter beyond what they could construct themselves, and a harsh environment that punished missteps with frostbite or death. The mission was clear, but the land itself set the terms. Led by Lieutenant Victor Campbell, the Northern Party consisted of 6 men, whose mission combined exploration, geological observation, and the collection of meteorological data across uncharted glaciers. Each member brought a specific skill, navigation, geology, photography, or meteorology, but all shared the same vulnerability, dependence on rudimentary supplies and the fragile sledges that would carry them across ice and rock. They were equipped with provisions intended to last weeks, not months, and any miscalculation could quickly tip the balance between survival and calamity. Their cohesion as a unit and their ability to adapt would soon become the measure of their endurance. The first weeks of travel brought cautious optimism as sledges slid over packed snow, and rocky ridges offered vantage points from which the frozen landscape unfolded with austere grandeur. Crests revealed distant peaks and hidden valleys, and the explorers diligently recorded each observation. Spirits were high despite the monotony of walking hour after hour through biting wind and snow that crusted over their boots. They learned to read the terrain with precision, noting subtle differences in snow texture and the angles of glaciers that hinted at crevasses beneath. Every day brought progress, but also a reminder of the unpredictable environment they had entered. Yet the Antarctic's temperament revealed itself in sudden whiteouts, hidden crevasses and shifting sea ice, reminding the explorers that every step could conceal danger. A thin crust of snow could collapse under the weight of a sledge, plunging men and supplies into an icy fissure. Winds capable of stripping skin and freezing exposed fingers arrived without warning, while visibility could drop to near zero in moments, leaving the party disoriented and forced to halt. The land, vast and unyielding, measured human ambition against the immense forces of nature, and every hazard demanded attention and caution. Supplies began to dwindle sooner than expected, and the strain of hauling sledges across uneven terrain tested both the men's endurance and their fragile morale. Food rations were meticulously calculated, and every ounce of flour, pemmican, or chocolate bar became precious. Sledges frequently required repair, and the men rotated tasks to prevent exhaustion from undermining their progress. Yet fatigue was relentless, and the psychological weight of isolation added a layer of tension that even the most disciplined explorers could not fully ignore. Each day became a careful negotiation between exertion and conservation. Decisions became increasingly urgent as the team debated whether to push forward, seek shelter in makeshift ice caves, or retreat toward a pre-established depot, each option carrying its own peril. The ice was unpredictable, melting or cracking in ways that maps could not foresee. Crevasses opened in patterns invisible until too late, and the risk of losing supplies or men was constant. Campbell's leadership involved careful deliberation, balancing the immediate needs of the party with the long-term goal of survival. Every choice was fraught, and each carried consequences that would echo across weeks of travel and exposure. When winter arrived, the party hunkered down in a snow shelter, enduring months of darkness, near constant cold, and the ever-present risk of frostbite that gnawed at fingers and toes alike. They insulated their small dugout with snow blocks, creating walls that could deflect wind and retain some warmth, while rations were stretched to their limits. The cold was relentless, seeping through clothing and skin, testing endurance and willpower. Nights were long and featureless, broken only by the occasional sound of ice cracking in the distance. Even within the shelter, every breath, every movement demanded effort and precision. Journals, sketches, and meticulous notes recorded every storm, ice fracture, and distant mountain peak. Yet these fragments could never fully convey the men's isolation or the subtle shifts of the environment around them. Campbell and his colleagues documented wind speed, temperature changes, and the morphology of the ice as carefully as they could. Observations of penguins or seals offered fleeting reminders that life existed beyond their small circle, yet even these creatures were adapted to extremes the men could only endure. Each entry revealed competence and curiosity, but also hinted at the cumulative strain of days spent navigating unyielding terrain. As rations diminished and injuries accumulated, the explorers faced the relentless awareness that the Antarctic would not yield to human ambition, and that their survival depended on equal parts luck and careful judgment. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers despite their careful clothing, while exhaustion slowed every step. Each movement required deliberation, and each rest period became a critical opportunity to recover. The men's endurance was extraordinary, but the environment remained impartial, indifferent to courage, planning, or skill. Survival depended on the fine line between careful action and the inevitable hazards of ice, wind, and exposure. When the thaw finally arrived, the men attempted to traverse the frozen coast to reunite with the main expedition, leaving behind traces of their passage that would be discovered only later among scattered caches and journals. Travel remained slow and hazardous, as melting ice weakened bridges over hidden crevasses and softened snow threatened sledges with every step. Food was rationed to the last portion, and the men moved with extreme caution, aware that any misstep could undo weeks of perseverance. Yet even in these final stages, their focus and discipline allowed them to survive, demonstrating human resilience in one of the most extreme environments on the planet. Long after their journey, the Northern Party's ordeal remained a stark illustration of the tenuous balance between human resolve and the indifferent, unforgiving landscape of Antarctica. Historical accounts, diaries, and photographs preserved fragments of the experience, but the minute-to-minute reality of life on the ice can never be fully conveyed. Researchers studying the expedition can reconstruct paths, map shelters, and approximate hardships, but the lived experience, the cold that bites, the endless white, the constant vigilance, is largely left to imagination. The Northern Party's story is at once a record of achievement and a reminder of how fragile human survival can be. The icefields preserve their footsteps and whispered struggles, a record of endurance whose full story the continent keeps hidden beneath its endless white. The New Guinea Hagen Range Patrol, 1938. In the shadow of the towering Hagen Range, a small patrol vanished into dense forests where rivers and cliffs had erased most paths known to outsiders. The peaks rose abruptly from lowland valleys, their slopes shrouded in mist and dense vegetation, creating an environment both awe-inspiring and perilous. Few had ventured into these mountains, and even those who attempted to chart the region often returned with tales of treacherous terrain, sudden storms, and rivers that seemed to flow backward in narrow gorges. In early 1938, a patrol set out under colonial directive, tasked with mapping and securing routes through this largely unexplored territory, unaware that the mountains themselves would prove a far more formidable challenge than any human miscalculation. Comprised of colonial officers and local porters, the patrol carried instruments, supplies, and rudimentary maps intended to chart previously unexplored valleys and plateaus. Each man had a precise role: the officers to navigate and record coordinates, the porters to transport essential equipment, and local guides to bridge the gap between the outsider's knowledge and the terrain's subtle dangers. Yet even the guides, whose familiarity with lower slopes proved invaluable, were wary of venturing too far into higher ridges where the land became less predictable, the vegetation thicker, and the rivers more volatile. Every item they carried, theodolites, compasses, canvas tents, and rations, was weighed with care, for in these mountains every extra kilogram could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Their initial trek through foothills and moss-covered lowlands was slow but steady, guided by the faint trails known only to local guides who moved with uncanny familiarity. Birds of brilliant colours darted through the canopy above, while the undergrowth, damp with recent rains, clung to boots and clothing. River crossings required balancing on narrow logs or hopping between slippery stones, and in moments of quiet, the patrol observed how the mountains seemed to breathe with the wind, clouds rolling down slopes as though alive. Despite the relative safety of the lower terrain, the men sensed the wilderness as a constant, patient observer, noting every misstep, every slight hesitation as a potential prelude to misfortune. As they ascended into higher elevations, mist thickened, rainfall became relentless, and steep ridges challenged every step, leaving the patrol vulnerable to hidden pitfalls. Paths once visible disappeared into dense foliage, and the slightest misjudgment could lead to a treacherous fall. Rocks, softened by persistent rain, sometimes gave way under the weight of boots, and the men learned to move in single file, testing each foothold before committing their weight. At night, the wind whipped through narrow valleys, carrying with it the distant roar of waterfalls and the occasional crack of falling debris, sounds that reminded the patrol of the fragility of human presence in such remote terrain. Exhaustion and illness began to strain both men and porters, while tropical insects, unpredictable weather, and swollen rivers tested their resolve at every turn. Malaria, dysentery, and fever were constant companions, and even minor cuts or blisters threatened infection in the humid environment. Porters complained of fatigue, and officers struggled to maintain morale as rations dwindled faster than anticipated. Torrential downpours transformed trails into mud rivers, and every crossing of a swollen stream was a gamble, the current capable of sweeping supplies or even men into the depths below. Each day demanded careful calculation of risk versus progress, yet the mountains did not yield to caution alone. Decisions over camp locations, rationing, and navigation became critical, with each choice carrying potential consequences for the party's survival. The patrol debated whether to follow a ridge to higher ground, risking exposure to wind and rain, or to descend into a sheltered valley, which might provide temporary respite but delay progress toward mapped objectives. Campsites were chosen for proximity to water and safety from mudslides, yet no location could guarantee protection from the unpredictable climate. Officers meticulously logged these decisions, aware that every choice not only affected the immediate safety of the men, but could leave traces for future investigators to interpret. Increasing isolation removed any certainty of assistance, as the team advanced deeper into terrain mapped only by imagination and fragmentary reports. Villages grew distant, communication impossible, and local guides became uneasy as they approached regions rumoured to be impassable or home to unfamiliar tribes. The patrol carried a growing sense of invisibility, aware that the mountains could conceal them entirely from the outside world. Each ridge they crossed and each stream they forded carried them farther into an environment that, for all its beauty, demanded respect, vigilance, and an awareness that the wilderness rarely forgives error. Careful notes and sketches documented unusual flora, fauna, and geological formations, yet every entry hinted at the growing challenge of maintaining orientation and cohesion. Trees with enormous buttress roots, orchids clinging to vertical cliffs, and birds with calls that echoed across valleys filled their journals. But the men wrote quickly, sometimes stopping mid-entry to brace against sudden rain or check for footing. Observations of local wildlife, such as nesting eagles or stealthy wild pigs, were recorded alongside descriptions of soil erosion and unstable ridges, fragments that now serve as some of the few surviving traces of the patrol's journey. Signs of distress appeared in missed waypoints, exhausted porters, and the subtle erosion of supplies, while sudden mudslides and treacherous river crossings reminded the patrol of nature's indifference. Days extended without clear progress, and each misstep compounded the strain on the group. Porters faltered, equipment was damaged, and provisions that were intended to last weeks disappeared within days. Letters and sketches hint at whispered conversations weighing whether to continue or turn back. Yet the mountains offered no guidance, only the unyielding rhythm of rivers, rainfall, and cliff-lined valleys. Their last movements toward a distant settlement were never confirmed, leaving only scattered journals, partial observations, and oral recollections to suggest what might have happened. Traces of campsites, footprints, and discarded equipment were found months later, but the party itself had vanished, leaving gaps that no map or report could fully reconcile. Stories from local villagers hinted at glimpses of figures in fog-laden valleys, yet none could verify the fate of the patrol or explain the precise sequence of events leading to their disappearance. Subsequent investigations offered tantalizing glimpses of their route, but the dense forests and precipitous ridges obscured definitive answers. preserving the mystery of their fate. Later expeditions retraced portions of the patrol's journey, discovering journals in partially submerged caches or abandoned campsites. Yet the ultimate conclusion, how the patrol vanished entirely, remains elusive. Each recovered fragment emphasizes the difficulty of surviving such terrain and the persistent dominance of the environment over human endeavor. Mist and canopy conceal every trace of the patrol, leaving only questions that climb higher than the peaks themselves. The Kamadavan incident, 1993. A small expedition of mountaineers and researchers set out into the Kamadavan range, unaware that the mountain's dense forests and sudden storms would obscure every trace of their passage. Spanning rugged ridges, narrow valleys, and heavily forested slopes, the region was known to a few locals but remained largely uncharted by outsiders. On the morning of departure, the expedition moved with purpose, confident in their preparation, yet the atmosphere of the mountains suggested a silent, almost watchful presence. Every rustle in the undergrowth and distant roar of rivers served as a reminder that the wilderness had its own rules, indifferent to human planning or ambition. Composed of local mountaineers, students, and researchers, the expedition carried tents, climbing gear, and equipment for scientific observation, all meticulously packed for a fortnight in isolation. Each member had a defined role, some to document wildlife and vegetation, others to survey topographical features, and the most experienced climbers to scout and maintain a route through the unpredictable terrain. While their training and experience were notable, even the most seasoned among them would soon discover that technical skill alone could not contend with the dense canopy, hidden ravines, and the sudden onset of violent storms that characterized the Kamadavan. Rivers swollen from early autumn rains slowed progress, forcing careful navigation along narrow, slippery paths lined with moss and jagged rocks. Crossing these waterways required balance, improvisation, and sometimes brute force, as fallen logs or makeshift bridges offered uncertain passage. At times, the patrol halted for hours, waiting for water levels to subside or for sunlight to illuminate a route that seemed to vanish under the forest canopy. The men observed the forest with quiet vigilance, noting subtle changes in terrain, unfamiliar plant species, and the occasional movement of wildlife, each observation a small anchor to orientation in an environment that seemed intent on disorienting them. Mist settled over higher ridges, reducing visibility to mere meters and making each step a calculated risk on slopes slick with recent rainfall. Shadows formed illusions, and even familiar landmarks appeared altered or doubled by the swirling fog. Occasional gusts swept through the valleys, carrying leaves, branches, and a chilling dampness that penetrated clothing and slowed movement. Navigational instruments, though functional, offered only partial reassurance as the magnetic readings fluctuated with the terrain, compounding the difficulty of staying on the intended route. Each day the patrol's awareness of their vulnerability grew, tempered by the knowledge that one misstep could lead to a fall, a broken limb, or worse. Muscle fatigue, exposure to cold, and minor injuries compounded by damp conditions tested the resilience of even the most experienced hikers. While insects and forest undergrowth gnawed at both stamina and morale, blisters became open sores, cuts threatened infection, and the constant buzz of mosquitoes and gnats drained concentration. Food rations, initially sufficient, diminished more quickly than anticipated as exhaustion increased appetite, leaving officers to ration carefully while maintaining morale. Sleep was fitful, often interrupted by the sounds of distant animals or the rush of rain cascading from higher slopes, a reminder that the forest was alive and unpredictable. Each campsite was chosen with care, balancing proximity to water, protection from the wind, and accessibility to the planned route, yet even the most cautious choice carried hidden hazards. A seemingly flat clearing might conceal unstable soil beneath layers of moss, or be vulnerable to flash floods from sudden rainfall upstream. In one instance, a small mudslide washed through the edge of a camp, damaging tents and equipment, an early warning of the dangers that lay ahead. Journals noted these incidents, yet, despite detailed observations, the patrol's sense of control over the environment steadily eroded. Mobile signals failed almost immediately in the higher valleys, leaving the group reliant on maps, compasses, and intuition as the forest seemed to swallow every sound and movement. Messages intended for the base camp went untransmitted, and hours stretched into days without verification of progress, The patrol became increasingly isolated, the canopy above so thick that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor, creating a dim, ever-shifting labyrinth. Communication between members became critical, as minor disagreements about route choices or camp placements had larger consequences in the absence of outside guidance. Missed landmarks, delayed departures, and scattered notes hinted that the expedition had begun to struggle with orientation, while faint tracks suggested a growing divergence from the intended route. Observers later noted discrepancies between maps and recovered journals, indicating that the patrol may have attempted to adjust its path in response to terrain or weather, a decision whose outcomes remained uncertain. The fragile nature of human perception in the thick forest likely contributed to errors, as distances and slopes were distorted by fog, foliage, and the relentless verticality of the ridges. Witness reports from nearby settlements described unusual weather patterns and sudden whiteouts during the expedition period, yet no explanation reconciled these events with the route the hikers were known to have taken. Residents recalled dense fogs that lingered for days, torrential rains that transformed narrow gullies into raging torrents, and unseasonal cold snaps that would chill even those acclimated to mountain conditions. These accounts suggested a level of unpredictability in the environment that could easily overwhelm even a well-prepared group, and later investigators struggled to reconcile local anecdotes with fragmentary expedition data. Tents were later found partially collapsed, personal items scattered, and footprints abruptly ceasing near steep slopes, leaving only speculation about the circumstances that led to the disappearance. Some journals were recovered, often waterlogged or torn, providing glimpses into the group's dwindling morale, but no complete sequence of events could be reconstructed. Search parties scoured nearby ridges and valleys, following traces that ended abruptly or vanished entirely, leaving a landscape that seemed determined to erase any evidence of what had transpired. Months of searches revealed fragments of equipment and journal pages, but the majority of the expedition remained unaccounted for, leaving investigators with only inconclusive data and a landscape that resisted all attempts at clarity. Experts in mountaineering, meteorology, and forestry examined the evidence, yet none could offer a definitive explanation for how the patrol disappeared so completely. Each recovered item raised as many questions as it answered, and the absence of human remains added to the enduring sense of mystery, underscoring the forest's capacity to conceal both presence and passage. The Kamadavan Mountains retain no answers, only the haunting impression of footsteps that vanished as though the earth itself had swallowed them. The Overton Mountain Expedition, 1934. Surveyor instruments clicked and ticked as the team advanced along the narrow ridge, each step measured against the shifting terrain of Overton Mountain, unaware that the forested slopes would soon swallow their progress entirely. The expedition, commissioned to map the largely unexplored northern ridges and catalogue flora and fauna, began under the impression that careful planning and local guidance would ensure a straightforward trek. Yet, as the dense canopy closed above them, the sunlight dimmed and the familiar rhythm of travel gave way to a creeping unease, as though the mountain itself was testing the resolve of those who dared traverse it. Each slope seemed steeper than the last, every bend in the trail offering the illusion of passage while threatening to conceal unseen hazards. Carrying compasses, notebooks, and provisions for 10 days, the group's composition blended experienced surveyors with local guides, familiar with the forest's deceptive trails. There was a deliberate balance of skill sets. A few members had traversed similar ranges before, while others were brought in for botanical and geological expertise. Their pace was cautious, and interactions were minimal, as each step demanded attention and coordination. Yet even with careful preparation, the weight of instruments and supplies began to take a toll, subtly influencing decision-making and fraying the patience necessary for sustained navigation. The mountain, indifferent to human planning, presented conditions that could transform measured caution into peril. Streams fed by recent rains surged unpredictably across the path, forcing careful footing while hidden crevices threatened to upend even the most cautious walker. Rocks slick with water and moss created a treacherous surface, and narrow log bridges, once thought solid, gave way under the pressure of a single footstep. Every crossing demanded full attention, and minor miscalculations were amplified in this unforgiving environment. The sound of rushing water masked subtle movements of wildlife, yet also covered the occasional snap of a branch underfoot, keeping tension at the forefront of every member's mind. In this landscape, a small misstep could mean injury or the beginning of an irreversible cascade of consequences. Gusts of wind funneled through the tree line, twisting branches and stirring an eerie silence that seemed to shadow every decision the hikers made. Occasional bursts rattled loose stones and scattered foliage across the path, creating transient obstacles that demanded split-second adjustments. These gusts were unpredictable, arriving without warning and disappearing just as quickly, leaving the travellers to wonder if their perception of movement and sound could be trusted. In some instances, the wind carried fragments of scent and sound from distant locations, disorienting even those most accustomed to reading the forest. The air itself seemed to conspire with the terrain, shaping a tense atmosphere that was hard to articulate, yet impossible to ignore. Fatigue grew steadily, amplified by cold, damp clothing and sore muscles, leaving each member acutely conscious of how quickly the routine of travel could become a battle for survival. Hours passed with little reprieve, the energy needed to maintain balance, observe landmarks and track notes in field journals accumulated into exhaustion. Even minor injuries, a twisted ankle or a scraped knee, produced a compound effect when layered onto the damp cold and the psychological strain of isolation. As the expedition progressed, subtle signs of stress emerged in hurried notes, terse observations, and quieter speech among the team, signalling that the mountain's demands were beginning to outweigh the travellers' carefully cultivated confidence. Choosing a campsite became a test of judgment, balancing shelter, safety from sudden flooding, and proximity to the next waypoint, yet the forest offered no certainty. Small clearings appeared promising, only to reveal hidden dips where water could accumulate overnight. Rocks and tree roots interfered with tent placement, and the threat of sudden wind gusts forced repeated adjustments. Each decision carried weight. Even minor miscalculations might compromise safety for the entire group. Meals were simple, the focus on conserving energy and maintaining equipment rather than comfort, but the psychological effects of an uneasy night left lingering tension that carried into the following day. Attempts at communication with the base failed, leaving the expedition dependent on navigation through landmarks that appeared distorted in the fog and shifting light. Radio signals failed to penetrate the dense forest canopy, and sunlight, when it briefly appeared, cast deceptive shadows that could be misread as familiar features. Maps provided general orientation, yet lacked the granularity to account for sudden ridges, hidden ravines, and the labyrinthine complexity of the slopes. The guide's intimate knowledge of the region helped, but even they struggled to reconcile memory with reality as landmarks became obscured and trails less distinct. Reliance on compass and intuition became absolute, a fragile tether in the heart of an indifferent wilderness. Notebooks and journals recorded moments of disorientation, a path that ended abruptly, a tree that seemed to shift position, subtle anomalies that unsettled even the most methodical explorers. One observer noted the peculiar straightness of a fallen tree in a clearing inconsistent with natural patterns, while another marked a river bend that did not match any prior reference. These entries, when reviewed later, suggested a creeping uncertainty in perception, a psychological overlay imposed by isolation, weather, and terrain. The mountain, in its vastness, eroded a linear understanding of space, leaving only fragments of experience recorded in ink, often without a clear explanation. Villagers later recounted severe storms coinciding with the expedition's progress, with sudden downpours, lightning, and temperature drops that rendered familiar trails hazardous and invisible. Such accounts described mudslides and torrents forming overnight, swallowing previous landmarks and depositing debris that erased the faint traces of human passage. These conditions compounded the difficulty for search parties and contributed to the disappearance of the hikers. Witness testimony, though fragmented and sometimes contradictory, reinforced the sense of a wilderness capable of swallowing those who venture into it, unprepared for the speed and intensity of environmental change. When search teams eventually arrived, they found scattered personal effects, a collapsed tent and footprints that abruptly vanished near a steep slope, leaving no further indication of the traveller's fate. There were instruments cracked by impact, journals dampened by water, and clothing torn as though caught by unseen obstacles, yet no bodies or direct explanation for the disappearance. Rescue attempts had been hampered by persistent fog and the same unpredictable topography that challenged the original expedition. Every recovered item raised more questions than answers, offering tantalizing hints but no definitive narrative of the team's final hours. Only fragments of instruments, torn pages and clothing could be pieced together, offering investigators tantalizing hints, yet failing to illuminate the majority of the expedition's final steps. The combination of lost trail, environmental destruction, and time ensured that the mountain retained its secrets. Analysts could reconstruct partial routes and speculate on movements based on scattered evidence, but the ultimate fate of those who ventured along the Overton ridges remained unknown. Each item recovered hinted at decisions, movements and missteps, yet left the core mystery intact, a testament to the mountain's dominance over human endeavour. No trail, no signal, and no whisper remains. Overton Mountain guards the fate of the expedition beyond the reach of certainty. The Wrangel Island, Karluk Survivors March, 1914. Ice groaned beneath weary boots as the remaining crew began their desperate trek across the shattered remains of the Arctic pack, each step weighed down by exhaustion and uncertainty. The Karluk had been trapped and crushed by the shifting ice of the Chukchi Sea weeks earlier, and now a handful of survivors faced a relentless march toward Wrangel Island, their only hope for rescue. The Arctic wind cut through layers of clothing, and each man felt the invisible weight of isolation pressing against their resolve. Even the familiar landmarks of sea ice and frozen channels had become alien in the disorienting glare of snow and sun, turning navigation into a perilous experiment in endurance and perception. With each passing hour, the survivors' progress seemed to vanish into the vast white horizon, leaving only the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The survivors numbered only a fraction of the original Karluk complement, a mix of expedition officers, scientists, and Inuit guides, each carrying the scars of the initial shipwreck. Captain Robert Bartlett, seasoned and unyielding, led them with cautious determination, aware that a single misstep could doom them all. The Inuit members of the party, attuned to the Arctic's rhythm, moved with a quiet, measured certainty, yet even they were not immune to the cold or fatigue that gnawed at their limbs. Every survivor bore the psychological toll of having witnessed friends and colleagues swallowed by the ice, and each step forward was a test of both body and mind. Channels of broken ice forced the party to improvise constantly, dragging sleds over unstable surfaces while praying that hidden cracks would not claim them. The ice shifted and moaned unpredictably, creating gaps that sometimes extended for yards, filled with brackish water that threatened to swallow the unwary. Wooden sleds splintered, and improvised ropes frayed under the strain, demanding a delicate balance between speed and caution. The survivors had no choice but to press forward, measuring each movement against the treacherous geometry of the Arctic terrain. Even familiar techniques of hauling and bridging were confounded by the shifting floor beneath them, turning every attempt to advance into a nerve-wracking exercise in survival. Frostbite and fatigue set in quickly, with fingers and toes growing numb as the cold pierced even their thickest clothing, testing their endurance and will. Sleep became impossible to attain, as even a few minutes of rest meant risking frostbite or the loss of a critical route marker. Faces and extremities hardened and cracked under the harsh wind, leaving a trail of physical deterioration that mirrored the psychological strain of the march. The cold was not a passive presence, it demanded vigilance, demanded movement, and punished hesitation with increasing severity. Each man's body seemed to betray him, a quiet rebellion that only compounded the isolation of the journey. Arguments flared over direction and speed, tension sharpened by hunger and the cruel awareness of comrades who had already fallen behind or vanished entirely. Bartlett, aware that decisions could mean life or death, attempted to impose order, yet the party was fraying at the edges. Disagreements over whether to follow ice channels or traverse open tundra escalated, voices hoarse with cold and exhaustion, while the quiet, methodical guidance of the Inuit members provided an uneasy counterpoint. Each disagreement carried the invisible weight of potential catastrophe, every misjudgment amplified by the unforgiving terrain and the survivors' increasingly fragile states of mind. Arctic storms erupted without warning, reducing visibility to near zero and battering the survivors with wind-driven snow, forcing them to huddle or risk being swept away. Blizzards obscured the horizon, turning simple navigation into a life-or-death gamble. Ice ridges were hidden beneath fresh snowfall, crevices masked by wind-packed drifts, and subtle changes in the landscape could no longer be trusted. Tents and shelters offered little protection, and even a brief pause exposed hands, faces and feet to the relentless assault of wind and frost. Each storm became a gauntlet, testing not only their physical endurance but also the cohesion and morale of the group. Provisions dwindled faster than expected, and desperate measures were taken. Rations were halved, fish were caught from icy waters, and blubber from seals offered rare sustenance. Despite these measures, hunger gnawed at every step, slowing progress and heightening tension among the exhausted travellers. Food scarcity forced choices that weighed heavily on the survivors' minds, whether to leave weaker members behind temporarily or risk slowing the entire group to carry what little sustenance remained. Every meal became an exercise in rationing, and the psychological strain of near starvation mingled with the physical toll of the Arctic, creating a relentless pressure that seemed impossible to endure. Some members lagged, succumbing to exhaustion or injury, while the stronger pressed onward, the group fracturing under the relentless demands of the frozen landscape. The Arctic made no allowances for weakness. Those who fell could not easily be rescued. Small groups disappeared, swallowed by ridges, snowdrifts, or ice ridges that had shifted overnight. The remaining survivors pressed forward, each step a negotiation between hope and inevitability, their senses alert for sounds of collapse or the distant cries of a companion now lost to the whiteness. The occasional tracks of Arctic foxes or distant cries of seabirds were a cruel reminder of life continuing around them, yet offered no guarantee of safety or rescue. Even the animals, resilient and adapted to the climate, seemed to emphasize the survivors' isolation, moving with agility that the humans could no longer muster. Birds called from the ridges above, distant and dissonant, and foxes darted along exposed ice, indifferent to human suffering. The presence of life outside the march's fragile human circle underscored the extreme vulnerability of the travellers and the magnitude of what they faced in the barren wilderness. When the first rescuers finally appeared weeks later, they found survivors in a state of near collapse, some having endured unimaginable hardship, while many companions had disappeared without a trace. Faces were emaciated, hands raw and scarred, and clothing tattered beyond repair. Stories of frozen feet, desperate improvisations, and harrowing nights were recounted by those who survived, yet each tale was punctuated by silence, a recognition that most of their companions' fates would remain unknown. The Arctic had exacted its toll, indifferent to the human drama unfolding across its frozen expanses. Only scattered journals, frozen implements, and fragmentary recollections remained to tell the story of the march, leaving gaps that even modern historians cannot fully resolve. Pages were weathered by snow and moisture, notes smudged or torn, maps incomplete, and photographs frozen into ice. Historians have attempted to reconstruct the route and sequence of events, yet much of the march's detail remains conjectural, lost to the Arctic's impermanence. What can be pieced together tells a story of endurance, isolation, and tragedy, yet also serves as a haunting reminder of the unknown that continues to pervade the frozen north. Beneath the unbroken white horizon, the Arctic silently kept its toll, a haunting testament to those who vanished along the icebound trail. The Patagonian Andes Survey, 1908. The Patagonian Andes Survey of 1908 has endured in maps and archives as a phantom in the southern Patagonian icefield, a boundary mapping mission that set out into the high glacial valleys along the Chile-Argentina frontier and never returned. In the years after the arbitral award between Argentina and Chile formalised the border from the high peaks of the Andes down toward the south, the region remained one of the least understood portions of the Cordillera, with many watersheds and passes unmapped or poorly charted, despite earlier expeditions by geographers and engineers. By the early years of the 20th century, Patagonia was a place where the natural world resisted all efforts at easy categorization, a vast expanse of icefields, peaks and erratic weather that confounded even seasoned explorers. The British arbitration that resolved the boundary dispute had relied in part on maps and observations by Argentine and Chilean surveyors, tracing the highest continuous peaks and watershed divides described in the Boundary Treaty of 1881, but much of the terrain still lacked detailed topographic documentation. The southern Patagonian icefield, one of the largest non-polar ice masses in the world, presented a unique set of hazards to anyone attempting to traverse its frozen expanse. Situated between latitudes 49 degrees and 52 degrees S, and fed by an array of glaciers such as the vast Puy de Foual and the trending ice tongues toward Lake O'Higgins' San Martin. This region's glacial flows and hidden crevasses made each step perilous. Many of the geographical features that filled later atlases were unknown, or only tentatively plotted at the beginning of the 20th century. In the context of that era's mapping efforts, survey teams typically combined scientific ambition with the raw necessities of survival in remote wilderness. Expeditions to chart the region's rivers and peaks often travelled with minimal contact with the outside world for weeks or months at a time, relying on pack animals where possible and on their own wits when conditions turned against them. Cartographers and geodesists worked alongside mountain guides to try to pin down the contours of valleys that bled into darkness amid drifting snow and fog. The year 1908 was not the first time a scientific or government survey had ventured into Patagonia's icy reaches, but it may have been among the most ambitious. In the decades following the Boundary Treaty and the earlier work of engineers such as Francisco Pascasio Moreno, whose surveys in the late 19th century helped inform national claims, the desire for comprehensive cartographic data drove numerous field parties into territory that even native guides seldom traversed. Those earlier expeditions had made clear how quickly the environment could overwhelm human intentions. Once off established trails and deeper into the Cordillera's web of peaks and glaciers, crews faced unpredictable weather systems that could blow from the Pacific or from the Patagonian steppe with little warning. Snowstorms could reduce visibility to nil, and bitter katabatic winds funneled down icy slopes could throw tents and instruments to the ground. Even as instruments for measuring altitude and position improved, the environment's indifference to human design remained absolute. On its departure in the austral winter of that year, the 1908 survey party set out from a base camp near the foothills that fringed the southern ice field. Earlier explorers had described this transition zone as a realm where dense forests and bogs give way abruptly to rock and snow, where rivers like the Palena and the Baker cut through granite gorges on their inexorable descent to the Pacific. The team's intended route toward higher glaciers passed landmarks that would later appear on maps only after painstaking fieldwork by subsequent parties. Reports from the last known weeks of the mission are frustratingly cryptic, consisting mainly of a few coded logs and a bundle of field notebooks returned by mule train before the final push into the heart of the ice field. Weather observations suggested a succession of cold fronts sweeping inland from the Pacific coast, and daily entries describe grueling progress as the team attempted to triangulate peaks like Cerro, Pier Giorgio, and Cerro Mayo, summiting knolls to gain vantage points for line-of-sight measurements. These mountains stand as silent witnesses in the modern landscape of Patagonia's border, their elevations recorded long after the survey's disappearance. When the party failed to check in according to its prearranged schedule, concerns among officials in both Santiago and Buenos Aires grew acute. Search efforts were mounted, but the terrain that confounded the 1908 expedition thwarted every attempt to follow in its footsteps. Crevasse fields, unstable glacier margins, and avalanche-prone slopes blocked access to the deeper valleys the missing team had hoped to map, and by the time rescuers reached key waypoints, much evidence of their passage had melted away or been buried under fresh snow. Over the decades that followed, occasional artifacts turned up along the edges of meltwater streams and moraines. A rusted instrument case, a weather-worn leather boot, a fragment of a survey flag marked with faint numbers. Each object spoke to the immense efforts the surveyors had made to penetrate the wilderness, yet none offered a clear account of what had befallen them when they crossed beyond the reach of human sight. Glaciologists and historians alike have tried to align them with the team's last known bearings, but the icefield's dynamic environment has altered landscapes and obscured paths in ways that no mapmaker could have foreseen. Modern satellite imagery and GPS mapping have filled many blanks on the old charts that the 1908 party hoped to complete, yet the southern Patagonian icefield remains a landscape of shifting surfaces and hidden hollows. Scientific teams continue to study climatic effects on glacier retreat and ice mass balance, and boundary commissions still reference landmarks established long ago, such as the main crests that define watersheds between Argentina and Chile. These efforts in technology and cooperation underscore how formidable the natural world was to those early surveyors, and how much remains beyond easy comprehension even today. In the end, the story of the Patagonian Andes survey, 1908, is not merely one of vanishing under extreme conditions, but of the enduring tension between human curiosity and the overwhelming scale of nature. The mountains and glaciers they sought to understand now hold their secret, and Patagonia's cold winds seem to whisper of journeys begun in hope and lost in silence. Footsteps that vanished into the endless white left behind no answer to what waited for them beneath the ancient ice. The Arnhem Land Prospecting Party, 1931. Thick vines and stagnant waterways hid the faint traces of men who ventured deep into northern Australia, leaving only rumours of their passage behind. In 1931, a small group of prospectors set out from the fringes of settled territory, drawn by tales of gold hidden in the rugged and largely uncharted bush of Arnhem Land. Their journey promised both fortune and isolation, yet the vastness of the landscape, punctuated by rivers that doubled as highways and barriers, would soon overwhelm their experience. Despite careful planning, the wilderness appeared to resist every effort to traverse it safely, swallowing tracks as swiftly as they were made. The fever of gold drove small parties into territories where few settlers dared to tread, and Arnhem Land was among the least charted of these frontiers. The 1920s had seen a modest boom in prospecting, yet the region's dense bush, seasonal floods, and remote escarpments kept permanent settlements minimal. Few maps existed, and knowledge of river courses and indigenous pathways remained fragmented. News of rich alluvial deposits spread quickly among prospectors in Darwin and Cairns, but venturing too far without local guidance or extensive provisions was a gamble few understood in full. A gamble that the 1931 party would not return to recount. Flooded plains stretched beyond sight, while sandstone escarpments rose abruptly from the jungle, creating a maze of shadowed cliffs and winding rivers that confounded even experienced trackers. The tropical heat pressed down relentlessly, and sudden downpours could transform dry tracks into impassable quagmires in minutes. The vegetation, thick with vines, pandanus, and towering palms, formed almost impenetrable walls, and the ever-present insects carried a constant reminder of human fragility in such a place. Even birds seemed cautious, their calls echoing strangely through valleys, a subtle warning to anyone who dared to penetrate further into the unknown. Supplies were loaded onto rough carts and pack animals, yet every plan had to reckon with the unpredictability of rivers that shifted after every storm. Provisions of flour, salted meat, and basic mining tools were insufficient for the dynamic conditions, and watercourses often forced detours that extended travel time. The prospectors relied partly on native guides, though contact was fleeting, and their knowledge could not fully compensate for the dense vegetation or the sudden monsoonal weather systems that could swell streams overnight. Every step was measured against uncertainty, and the further they moved into the interior, the less certain any return route became. The party moved cautiously through tangled undergrowth, noting the unusual density of termite mounds and the omnipresent hum of insects that seemed to track their every step. Days of marching revealed little of the landscape beyond a few recognizable features. Small hills and shallow lagoons appeared, disappeared, and transformed under the tropical sun and relentless rains. Each river crossing brought new challenges, with mud and fast currents threatening pack animals and equipment. The environment was at once familiar in its natural rhythms, yet alien in its scale and hostility, a living puzzle that resisted measurement and delayed progress. A makeshift camp was abandoned in haste, a torn canvas tent caught in low-hanging branches, suggesting the team had been forced onward under circumstances now lost to memory. Scattered tools and a tipped cooking fire hinted at an urgency that could not be explained from the remnants alone. No personal journals were recovered to clarify their decisions, and the absence of human traces beyond this camp left investigators grasping at the faintest threads of evidence. Each item spoke of intent, of effort, and of survival instinct, yet it also raised questions that have never been answered about how quickly the wilderness could claim those who entered it. Crocodile-infested rivers and sudden tropical deluges could erase footprints overnight, leaving nothing but mud and the faint scent of smoke from extinguished fires. Seasonal rains could flood lowlands in hours, while steep escarpments funneled winds that tore through campsites with unexpected ferocity. Even the most skilled trackers could only speculate about the prospectors' progress, as every day risked altering the landscape itself. The interplay of water, wind and vegetation created a constantly shifting stage, where human movements left only transient impressions, and the longer the search was delayed, the fewer clues remained visible to those trying to reconstruct the journey. Rescuers moving cautiously through the dense bush reported only fleeting glimpses of disturbed foliage and footprints that dissolved into the ever-shifting sands of creek beds. The harsh conditions limited the scope of search parties, and logistical challenges made prolonged operations nearly impossible. Even local Aboriginal trackers, familiar with parts of the terrain, could only interpret signs that were partial and fragmented. In the absence of bodies or definitive traces, theories about the party's fate varied, but nothing provided certainty. The vast wilderness seemed indifferent to the human desire for closure, holding the truth in its unbroken silence. Aboriginal guides spoke in cautious tones of paths known only to the spirits of the land, warning outsiders that the terrain would not easily surrender its secrets. Oral histories referenced travellers lost along the river bends and in dense scrub, where the jungle seemed to reclaim all human activity within days. While these accounts cannot be verified in the same way as contemporary records, they offer insight into the challenges faced by anyone venturing into Arnhem Land during the early 20th century. The wilderness, according to these voices, was not merely a backdrop, but a potent force capable of erasing human presence without leaving a trace. Long after the events, maps marked only tentative lines where the prospectors might have travelled, their disappearance an enduring enigma in the chronicles of Australian exploration. Later explorers pieced together portions of the terrain using improved surveying techniques and aerial photography, yet the jungle remained a labyrinth of uncertainty. The lack of physical evidence made the 1931 expedition a reference point in discussions of the dangers inherent to remote prospecting. Their fate has never been conclusively determined, and every attempt to reconstruct their route or intentions highlights how little is ever truly known of that unforgiving landscape. Satellite images now reveal rivers and escarpments in meticulous detail, yet the wilderness remains impenetrable enough to conceal all that occurred during those fateful weeks in 1931. Modern environmental studies note the rapid regrowth of vegetation and the periodic flooding that continuously reshapes the lowlands, erasing earlier human interventions. Arnhem Land today retains its remoteness, and the conditions that confounded a small gold prospecting party nearly a century ago remain largely unchanged, underscoring the enduring dominance of nature over human endeavour in this part of Australia. The jungle's relentless green has swallowed every clue, leaving their fate suspended in a silence that stretches unbroken across time. The Himalaya Nandicott Search Party, 1936. Sharp ridges and ice-choked gullies stretched into the distance as a British reconnaissance team ventured toward Nandicott, their presence soon to vanish without a trace from the high Himalayan slopes. In 1936, the mountain was largely unexplored, a labyrinth of glaciers and crevassed ridges that challenged even the most seasoned mountaineers. The team's mission was to chart potential climbing routes and survey terrain for future expeditions, yet the environment they entered demanded more than skill alone. Between altitude, exposure and the unyielding cold, every decision could determine life or disappearance, and Nandicott would soon demonstrate the merciless scale of the Himalayan peaks. The 1930s were an era of Himalayan reconnaissance, when climbers and surveyors pushed into lesser-known peaks to map routes for future expeditions, each ascent a delicate negotiation with unknown hazards. British mountaineering organisations had a growing interest in the Garhwal region, seeking both scientific data and potential climbing achievements. Expeditions combined surveying, geology and mountaineering expertise, but Nandicott's remote location, flanked by the Milam and Ralam glaciers, made even short reconnaissance treks dangerous. These teams operated with minimal outside contact, often weeks from the nearest village, relying on porters and guides for both transport and survival in the unforgiving high-altitude environment. Towering ridges and jagged glaciers stretched beyond sight, with hidden crevasses and seracs forming labyrinthine paths that blurred orientation and magnified every misstep into mortal risk. The ice was a shifting surface, constantly moulded by wind and temperature fluctuations, and crevasse edges could collapse under the lightest pressure. Snowfields reflected sunlight that made even familiar terrain appear disorienting, and the shadows of serrated peaks created visual illusions that challenged depth perception. Each morning brought a renewed negotiation with gravity and terrain, where progress was measured in careful steps, and the surrounding mountains seemed both impassive and indifferent to human endeavour. The team carried delicate surveying instruments alongside heavy packs of ropes and tents, relying on mountaineering expertise to navigate snowfields that shifted underfoot and ice that groaned beneath the cold. Altimeters, theodolites and barometers were essential for mapping the ridges, yet their weight compounded fatigue in oxygen-thin air. Tents and canvas shelters were fragile against sudden storms, and sleeping at high altitude offered little rest, with biting winds and cold-penetrating layers of wool and canvas. The balance of scientific ambition and survival was precarious, and every load carried uphill was a negotiation with both gravity and the mountain's caprice. Their first days traced the contours of steep glaciers, where every step required careful balance, and the air thinned so rapidly that breathing became a measured act of survival. Crests and snow ridges offered limited vantage points, yet the extreme altitude distorted perspective, making distant features appear deceptively close. Observations of icefall movement, snow stability, and ridge conditions were recorded meticulously, yet even accurate measurements could not prevent sudden avalanches or hidden seracs from altering the landscape. Each day of cautious surveying brought the team closer to the heart of the mountain, yet it also brought them further into a wilderness that had swallowed many who ventured before. Storm clouds gathered faster than anticipated, and subtle avalanches in distant gullies hinted at dangers that could strike without warning, testing both judgment and courage. The weather patterns in the Gahwal Himalaya were notoriously fickle, with snow squalls arising within hours and winds capable of tearing tents from stakes. Teams had to read snow conditions and ice stress constantly, yet even expert observation could not predict every collapse. The thin air amplified both cold and exhaustion, and decisions became a balance between achieving surveying goals and retreating to safety. The mountain's indifference left no margin for error. Beyond a narrow ridge, the party left only fragments of canvas and footprints fading into snow, the remainder of their journey erased by wind and shifting ice. There are brief accounts in surviving expedition logs of campsites abandoned hastily, yet no names or detailed routes survive. Crevasses may have concealed equipment or climbers, and storm-driven snow likely covered any temporary markings. Over time, these traces disappeared entirely, leaving only speculation for those who later attempted to reconstruct the party's route. The mountain had reclaimed the evidence of their presence, and with it the certainty of what had occurred vanished. Rescue teams combed the glaciers in successive seasons, finding only scattered equipment and the faintest impressions, evidence that nature had reclaimed the landscape before human eyes could record it. Even teams equipped with ropes, pulleys and ice axes struggled against the terrain. Avalanches and shifting ice constantly altered the environment. Nothing was found to explain how or why the party vanished, and the harsh conditions made extended searches impossible. Their disappearance became a cautionary note in Himalayan exploration, a reminder that human presence in these high reaches is fleeting, fragile, and easily erased. Local porters and Sherpa guides spoke of treacherous ridges and sudden storms that could vanish climbers in moments, knowledge steeped in generations yet largely unheeded by outsiders. Oral tradition emphasised the dangers of icefalls, sudden snow surges, and rockfall from upper ridges, yet formal expeditions often relied on technical skill and instruments, rather than local experience. These warnings underscore the reality that beyond equipment and expertise, survival in the high Himalaya depends on ear and intimate understanding of ever-changing conditions, knowledge that the 1936 party may have underestimated in their pursuit of mapping and reconnaissance. The Nandicott expedition remains a cautionary tale in Himalayan exploration, a reminder that even the most meticulous planning is fragile against peaks that dwarf human ambition. Historical accounts frame the event as both a scientific endeavour and a tragic misadventure, highlighting the contrast between measured surveying and the uncontrollable forces of nature. Subsequent mountaineers learned from these early reconnaissance efforts, using them to prepare for higher peaks such as Nanda Devi and Trisul, yet the 1936 party's fate remains unresolved. Their disappearance underscores the enduring tension between human curiosity and the vast, indifferent mountain environment. Modern mountaineers and satellite surveys can map every crevasse and ridge, yet the precise fate of the 1936 team remains hidden, their passage marked only by the relentless dynamics of ice, snow, and stone. Contemporary technology allows climbers to plan routes with precision, track glacier movement, and anticipate weather shifts, yet these tools cannot recover what was lost or illuminate the final moments of the reconnaissance party. The peaks remain as imposing and unyielding as they were in 1936, preserving the mystery within every ridge, hollow, and glacial sweep. Above the jagged ridges and silent glaciers, their journey lingers only in the cold whisper of wind through the Himalayan peaks. The Brooks Range Survey Team 1950. In the remote expanse of Alaska's Brooks Range, the US Geological Survey Team departed for what would become a journey from which no member ever returned, leaving only the silent tundra to mark their passage. The team's mission was to chart rivers, ridges and mineral formations across a largely unmapped northern landscape, one of the last great frontiers of continental North America. They carried out preliminary surveys with small aircraft, traversed valleys on foot, and relied on limited communications. But the combination of isolation, cold, and unpredictable weather meant that even routine operations could become perilous, and the wilderness soon claimed all certainty of their movements. The post-war years saw a surge of Arctic mapping initiatives, with the Geological Survey tasked with charting regions previously neglected due to extreme conditions. Funding and interest increased as Alaska's strategic and scientific value became clear, yet infrastructure remained minimal. Pilots and surveyors were trained for both navigation and survival, but the Brooks Range offered a stark challenge. Mountains, glaciers, and rivers that shifted seasonally, vast distances between camps, and virtually no external support. Each team's departure was accompanied by meticulous planning and hope, yet even the most prepared personnel faced the unpredictable severity of the Arctic environment. Mountains rose like frozen fortresses above endless stretches of tundra, while braided rivers carved channels that shifted beneath snow and ice, forming a terrain both uniform and treacherous. Vegetation was sparse, limited to hardy grasses, moss, and dwarf shrubs, yet the surface could conceal dangerous crevasses or unstable permafrost. Visibility could change abruptly, with low clouds and snowstorms erasing landmarks, making navigation a careful balance between compass readings, topographic observation, and instinct. The scale of the Brooks Range left surveyors dwarfed by their surroundings, and the distance between known points rendered errors not just inconvenient but potentially fatal. Surveyors, pilots, and support personnel relied on small aircraft, canvas tents, and rudimentary radios, their survival contingent on both skill and the fragile reliability of 1950s technology in extreme cold. Planes transported personnel and supplies between camps, yet the cold could freeze engines, radios could fail, and tents offered little protection against blizzards. Clothing was layered wool and canvas, far less effective than modern insulated gear, and even brief exposure to wind and freezing temperatures could induce frostbite. Every measurement, every observation, and every maneuver in camp or air carried risk, reminding the team that the environment itself was as formidable as any terrain feature. Flights carried men and supplies between temporary camps, yet sudden storms and whiteout conditions often forced landings in narrow valleys, transforming routine transit into a test of endurance and judgment. Crews needed to judge wind shifts, cloud density, and landing surfaces simultaneously, while considering aircraft limits and fuel. On foot, surveyors navigated tundra and shallow snowfields, where hidden water channels could swamp boots and supplies, and ice-covered rivers could fracture under weight. Every day required constant assessment of terrain, weather, and equipment, yet even meticulous preparation could not account for all variables in this remote Arctic wilderness. Early surveying produced careful maps and geological samples, while aerial reconnaissance photographed ridgelines, yet every observation was shadowed by the possibility of rapid weather changes or hidden ice hazards. Rivers marked by satellite imaging today were then uncertain pathways. Even the slightest misjudgment could force improvisation in fragile conditions. Instruments functioned imperfectly in extreme cold, and data collection demanded both precision and endurance, with limited means to correct errors. Despite their competence, the surveyors were at the mercy of nature, and their meticulous records became the only hint of human activity in a landscape that seemed determined to reclaim any trace. Radio check-ins became irregular, and unreported mechanical issues with the small aircraft hinted at problems that could escalate into catastrophe, yet no immediate alarm was raised beyond concern for minor delays. Crews at remote camps noted missed schedules, but winter storms and poor visibility often disrupted communications even without incident. Supplies might vanish from tents in transit or be buried under drifting snow, and aircraft engines, already unreliable and cold, could fail without warning. The combination of environmental extremity and technological fragility created a situation where disappearance could occur swiftly and leave no evidence, as the Brooks Range would soon demonstrate. The last confirmed communication noted a return to a northern ridge, but subsequent attempts to locate the team by air or on foot yielded only unbroken snowfields, suggesting the landscape had erased their presence almost entirely. Searchers followed projected flight paths and attempted to trace footprints or tent remnants, but drifting snow and rapidly shifting ice concealed all evidence. Reports of scattered equipment emerged inconsistently, often too far apart to establish a coherent trail. Within weeks, the Arctic silence had reclaimed every indication of human presence, leaving the team's fate as elusive as the vast and inhospitable terrain itself. Search parties combed valleys and glaciers over weeks, yet the combination of shifting snow, sparse landmarks, and vast distances ensured that nothing conclusive emerged from the Arctic silence. Survey records offered partial insight into their planned route, yet the physical markers that might have guided rescuers were erased by wind, snow accumulation, and seasonal thawing. Even seasoned bush pilots and experienced Arctic trackers found themselves confronted by an environment that demanded respect and patience. The disappearance became emblematic of the Brooks Range itself, remote, unforgiving, and able to absorb human endeavour without leaving a lasting trace. Inupiat hunters and trappers spoke of the Brooks Range as a domain where sudden storms, hidden ice, and treacherous slopes could claim travellers within hours, knowledge accumulated over generations yet largely absent from expedition planning. These warnings emphasised how localised experience and intuition were essential for survival, contrasting sharply with reliance on instruments and maps alone. For survey teams trained in technical precision rather than long-term Arctic observation, these hazards were often underestimated. The convergence of technological limits and environmental severity created conditions where even minor miscalculations could lead to complete disappearance. Even today, satellite imaging and advanced mapping reveal the contours of the region, but offer no clue to the survey team's final movements, underscoring the enduring enigma of human disappearance in extreme environments. The combination of Arctic isolation, shifting ice, and the scale of the Brooks Range ensures that much remains unknowable. While modern climbers and researchers can predict routes and monitor conditions with precision, the 1950 team's ultimate fate is irretrievably lost to time, leaving only the silent mountains as witnesses to what occurred. Somewhere amid frozen ridges and tundra plains, their expedition remains a question the Arctic itself refuses to answer. The Papuan Black River Expedition, 1927. The Papuan Black River Expedition of 1927 set out with canoes and supplies into dense rainforest, yet none of the explorers ever returned, leaving only the river's meanders and the jungle's whispers to hint at their fate. Their mission combined prospecting, surveying, and mapping largely uncharted tributaries, an endeavour that required navigating winding waterways, negotiating forested terrain, and relying on minimal local knowledge. Each day demanded caution, as hidden channels, sudden rapids, and submerged obstacles transformed the river into a labyrinth where human progress was easily stalled, and the forest quickly reclaimed any trace of passage. During the 1920s, prospecting parties ventured into New Guinea's interior in search of gold, timber, and cartographic knowledge, often navigating uncharted tributaries and negotiating the authority of local communities. Dutch colonial authorities encouraged exploration of the interior, yet access was limited by both terrain and logistical constraints. Small teams were equipped with basic supplies, limited communication methods, and rudimentary surveying instruments. The expedition's goal was to create maps for future resource exploitation and scientific observation, but the dense jungle and unpredictable river conditions ensured that even routine progress carried considerable risk. Towering trees blocked sunlight from the forest floor, while tangled undergrowth, swampy banks and hidden streams transformed the Black River's course into a shifting and treacherous maze. The thick canopy muffled sound, leaving only occasional calls of birds or the splash of a canoe paddle to break the silence. Fallen logs, quicksand-like mud and submerged roots were common obstacles, while sudden downpours turned dry trails into rivers of sludge. Visibility was limited, and navigation relied heavily on compasses and local markers, many of which were quickly obscured by the rapid growth and seasonal flooding of the rainforest, emphasizing how fleeting human presence was in this environment. The explorers carried hand tools, survey instruments, and food supplies packed in waterproof crates, relying on dugout canoes and rafts to traverse rapids and shallow waters that could overturn with little warning. They depended on physical endurance, precise handling of vessels, and careful attention to river conditions. Malaria, leeches, and heat exhaustion were constant threats, while the thick humidity and biting insects sapped energy even during short portages. Every camp required clearing a level patch from dense vegetation, and every night involved careful storage of equipment to prevent loss or damage from water, wildlife, or falling branches. Daily progress depended on portaging boats over fallen trees, wading through murky river shallows, and hacking trails through vine-choked passages, with each mile a slow negotiation with the forest's resistance. The team frequently encountered dense tangles of bamboo and palm, forcing them to carry boats over land for hours. Shallow sandbars concealed sharp rocks, while deep channels could unexpectedly swell from upstream rains. Exhaustion compounded by humidity and heat became as dangerous as the river itself. Every day they balanced between advancing their mission and surviving the hidden hazards that multiplied with each bend in the Black River. Mapping notes described braided channels, unusual rock formations, and local flora, while encounters with birds, reptiles, and large mammals hinted at the forest's abundant life and hidden dangers alike. Rare botanical samples were recorded, and the explorers made rudimentary sketches of river forks and landmarks. Yet the very act of observation was challenged by the jungle's density, with reference points obscured by overgrowth or shifted by seasonal water levels. Each note in the survey log captured a fleeting moment, soon to be overrun by the forest's relentless reclamation. Nature was patient, human progress was temporary. Illness among the team emerged quickly, with fevers, fatigue, and swollen limbs exacerbated by the relentless heat, humidity, and insects that carried unseen pathogens, slowing progress and straining morale. Even the strongest members experienced bouts of weakness, and untreated tropical diseases could incapacitate individuals within days. Mosquitoes, leeches, and biting flies compounded discomfort and risk, while the dense jungle limited opportunities for rest or medical attention. Small injuries became more serious when infected, and minor navigational errors could result in hours of delay, emphasizing that in this environment, survival was as much a matter of endurance as skill. The last camp was found abandoned, canoes pulled to the riverbank, and scattered personal effects suggested the party moved forward, but vanished without leaving a clear trail in the dense vegetation. Food supplies remained untouched in some cases, while tools and equipment were occasionally scattered downstream. Trees, vines, and undergrowth obscured paths almost immediately, and shifting riverbanks erased footprints within hours. The lack of a coherent trail frustrated searchers and underscored the forest's capacity to absorb all human activity, turning what should have been a temporary stop into a permanent vanishing point. Subsequent parties retraced the river's bends and side channels, yet thick jungle, seasonal flooding, and the ever-shifting river thwarted all efforts to locate the missing explorers or determine their final path. Expeditions using local guides combed sections of the river, checking tributaries and abandoned campsites, but evidence remained sparse. Floods had shifted debris, and dense undergrowth had reclaimed tracks, leaving only hints of human presence. Despite weeks of searching, the missing expedition's disappearance remained complete, a cautionary tale of both environmental dominance and the limits of early 20th century exploration. Papuan guides spoke of hidden whirlpools, sudden river swells, and treacherous mudbanks, warnings accumulated over generations that the expedition could scarcely anticipate and even less likely survive. Oral knowledge emphasized the impermanence of trails and the unpredictability of the river's channels, yet the explorers largely relied on maps and compasses. These accounts highlight the contrast between local environmental understanding and outsider assumptions of control. The guide stories, while lacking written documentation, reflect a deep familiarity with the forest and river that no European expedition could fully replicate, and that may have contributed to the expedition's ultimate disappearance. Today, aerial surveys and satellite imagery reveal the Black River's intricate network, yet no photograph or map can illuminate the fate of those who ventured deep into its heart in 1927. Modern technology shows channels, tributaries, and flood patterns with precision, but the forest density and constant change ensure that past events remain obscured. Archaeologists, historians, and explorers can speculate based on the terrain and surviving artifacts, yet the party's passage has left no conclusive evidence. The disappearance stands as a reminder of how easily human effort can vanish into the rainforest, where time and nature merge to obscure even the most determined intrusions. The Black River flows on through shadowed jungle and hidden bends, carrying no trace of the explorers who once dared to follow its winding course. The Tamanrasset Sahara crossing, 1913. Sunlight scorched the ridges of shifting sand as the 1913 French expedition pressed deeper into the Tamanrasset region, their path disappearing into an unbroken sea of dunes. Each day brought the harsh reality of the desert, temperatures soaring above what men and camels could endure, winds lifting fine sand into every crevice, and the horizon stretching endlessly, offering no reference point for navigation. The explorers relied on celestial cues, compasses, and rudimentary maps, yet the desert's scale rendered every calculation fragile. As footprints vanished behind them in minutes, the vastness of the Sahara seemed to swallow their presence, leaving only scattered evidence of their passage. The early 20th century saw European explorers venturing into the Sahara to map its deserts, document trade routes, and search for potential mineral wealth, often underestimating the environment's relentless demands. French authorities sought to extend geographic knowledge, and Tamanrasset, at the edge of the Hoggar Mountains, represented both a gateway and a challenge. Expeditions at this time were driven by ambition and the promise of discovery, yet the tools and knowledge they carried were minimal compared to the harshness of the desert itself. Even minor miscalculations could lead to rapid dehydration or loss, turning a routine crossing into a life-threatening ordeal. Sweeping dunes rose and fell like frozen waves of sand, interspersed with rocky plateaus and arid valleys, while daytime temperatures soared and night brought a biting chill across the barren expanse. Sunlight reflected off pale ridges, producing shimmering mirages that confused even the most experienced travelers. Sand shifted constantly, reshaping tracks and smoothing over signs of human passage within hours. Occasional dry riverbeds offered temporary relief, but often concealed hidden depressions or compacted sand that could trap camels or overturn supplies. The desert's ever-changing landscape made orientation almost impossible, emphasizing how ephemeral human presence was in such an environment. The expedition relied on camels for transport, carrying water, food, surveying instruments and tents, while explorers wore layered clothing to protect against sunburn by day and desert cold by night. Camels were both indispensable and vulnerable. Overheating, stumbling, or collapsing under the sun could halt progress entirely. Supplies had to be meticulously rationed, with water measured to the drop and food carefully distributed. Surveying tools, including compasses and sextants, demanded steady hands and clear skies, yet both were constantly compromised by windblown sand or sudden dust storms. Every element of survival depended on the delicate balance between skill, endurance, and the environment's whims. Each day involved careful rationing of water, precise calculation of travel distances, and navigation using rudimentary compasses and celestial cues, with the desert offering no margin for miscalculation. Camps were chosen for temporary shelter from wind or sun, but the lack of vegetation left little protection. Rest periods were brief, and even minor fatigue risked heat stroke or missteps on uneven dunes. The expedition's progress was slow and measured, yet the desert seemed to stretch each mile endlessly, erasing landmarks and diminishing any sense of security that the travelers might have carried from previous journeys. Notes recorded shifting sand formations, rare desert flora, and the distant silhouettes of rocky outcrops, while interactions with nomadic Tuareg hinted at long-established knowledge of hidden wells and safe passages. The explorers documented their surroundings meticulously, yet even detailed observations could not account for the desert's variability. Tuareg guides spoke of wells that appeared only seasonally and sand formations that could swallow tracks overnight. These warnings highlighted both the richness and the danger of the landscape. While the desert offered life-sustaining water and shelter in rare instances, it demanded respect, skill, and constant vigilance to survive. Signs of strain appeared within days. Camels faltered under the heat, men showed exhaustion and dehydration, and sudden wind gusts lifted sand into eyes and equipment, slowing progress to a crawl. Blisters, sunburn, and fatigue compounded with each passing mile. A misjudged path could force the group back into dunes that shifted like waves, costing precious hours. Even minor mistakes in rationing or direction risked cascading consequences, and the relentless environment allowed no margin for error. The desert, indifferent to human effort, had already begun to erode both the travellers' supplies and their confidence in survival. The final camp was found abandoned, tents intact but supplies missing, suggesting that the team attempted to continue onward, only to vanish into the vastness of shifting dunes and barren plains. Some camels were seen straying in the distance, their tracks quickly erased by the wind. Scattered equipment hinted at a hasty departure or forced flight, yet no notes or markers indicated a planned retreat. The desert's endless terrain transformed their disappearance into an enigma, a small human imprint erased within hours, leaving future searchers with only speculation about the choices made in their final hours. Subsequent search parties combed likely routes, scouring sand ridges and dry riverbeds, yet the desert's shifting surface erased tracks and scattered traces, leaving rescuers with little more than conjecture. Expeditions relying on Tuareg guides or aerial reconnaissance failed to locate definitive evidence of the missing team. Occasionally, fragments of a canvas tent or a water skin might surface, but these hints vanished as quickly as they appeared. The combination of heat, wind, and vast open terrain ensured that no lasting trace could survive, and the expedition became a stark reminder of the desert's power to absorb human endeavour completely. Tuareg guides warned of mirages, sudden sandstorms, and hidden depressions, emphasising a centuries-old understanding of the desert's dangers that the French explorers could scarcely replicate. Knowledge of seasonal winds, concealed water sources, and deceptively flat dunes was passed orally and trusted implicitly by those who lived in the Sahara. The French expedition's instruments and maps were of little help when confronted with nature's volatility. The contrast between local expertise and outsider assumptions highlights how quickly ambition and preparation could be rendered meaningless in a landscape that measured time and movement differently. Despite modern mapping and satellite imaging, the routes taken by the 1913 expedition remain uncertain, a stark reminder of the Sahara's capacity to absorb human endeavours without record or explanation. Even today, geographers and historians can trace probable paths, yet no evidence explains exactly what happened to the team. The desert's shape continues to change with wind and weather, and the sands will always conceal more than they reveal. The mystery endures, a testament to how human presence is fleeting in the face of one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Endless dunes stretch toward the horizon, and in their silent sweep, all evidence of the expedition has vanished beneath the desert's unyielding sands. The Sarak National Park researchers, 1961. By midwinter, the Sarak expedition had vanished entirely, leaving only scattered notes and unanswered questions about what became of the scientists who had ventured so far north. The Swedish Arctic Park, known for its glaciers, river gorges, and snow-covered peaks, offered both opportunity and extreme danger. The researchers entered with detailed plans and instruments, hoping to map unexplored glaciers and document ecological patterns. Yet, in this frozen expanse, their presence quickly diminished to faint tracks and faint traces of campfires, as the winter cold and isolation began to erode their ability to navigate, communicate, and survive. Sweden's early 1960s scientific programs aimed to understand the country's remote wilderness, with Sarak standing out as one of the least accessible areas in Scandinavia. Teams were tasked with recording glacial movement, observing wildlife, and surveying the terrain for ecological and geological patterns. Despite detailed preparation, the park's unpredictable conditions challenged even the most methodical researchers. Winter expeditions were rare, as snow and ice dramatically restricted mobility and compounded risks that were already significant in summer months. Authorities hoped that careful planning and professional expertise would mitigate these hazards, yet the park's remoteness remained a persistent obstacle. Jagged peaks and hidden valleys created a labyrinthine landscape, while glaciers and ice-filled rivers presented hazards that could immobilize even the most experienced team members. Crevasses lay concealed beneath thin layers of snow, and frozen rivers could give way under heavy sleds. Narrow valleys amplified wind and carried temperatures to brutal lows, while fog and snowdrifts disoriented those attempting to maintain bearings. Even landmarks that appeared familiar could shift dramatically under weeks of winter storms, leaving explorers to rely heavily on intuition and precise instruments for orientation. Every decision carried weight, and any misstep could prove catastrophic. The researchers carried surveying instruments, notebooks, and photographic equipment, layered in insulated clothing designed to withstand sub-zero temperatures. Though no gear could fully mitigate the Arctic's unpredictability, thermometers, barometers, and compasses were essential, yet each required careful handling in extreme cold to remain functional. Clothing layered in wool and insulated fabrics offered some protection, but frostbite and hypothermia remained constant threats. The team also brought food rations and portable stoves, which demanded careful fuel management, as any interruption could compromise the ability to prepare hot meals or melt snow for drinking water. Travel was painstakingly measured. Sleds and skis aided movement across snowfields, yet every day required careful rationing of supplies and constant vigilance against fatigue or frostbite. Progress across glaciers was slow, with each kilometre taking hours of navigation and effort. Snowstorms and drifting ice added uncertainty, forcing the researchers to pause frequently and adjust their route. Even short rest periods risked exposure to the cold, as winds could strip warmth from clothing and seep through tents. The combination of exertion and environment tested endurance and morale, illustrating how unforgiving the park could be to even the most prepared expedition. Detailed entries recorded glacier formations, ice thickness, and wildlife activity, revealing the team's methodical approach and dedication, even as winter deepened around them. Notes on snow layers, crevasse positions, and the occasional sighting of reindeer or fox tracks conveyed both scientific curiosity and the isolation of the landscape. Photographs captured icy riverbeds and the undulating contours of glaciers, yet they also documented how quickly weather could obscure landmarks. The meticulous recording of observations reflected the researchers' professionalism, but it also highlighted how fragile such documentation could be when confronted with the relentless forces of Arctic winter. Whiteout conditions and mechanical failures began to disrupt schedules, while minor frostbite and exhaustion hinted at the growing peril that winter imposed on the expedition. Sled runners froze, compasses misread, and instruments became unreliable under persistent cold. Snowstorms reduced visibility to mere meters, turning familiar valleys into indistinguishable white expanses. Team members had to constantly check each other for early signs of frostbite or hypothermia, yet the extreme environment eroded even the most cautious planning. Each day brought a mounting sense of risk, as the expedition pressed onward despite mounting evidence of nature's indifference. Campsites were discovered abandoned, with partially used supplies and scattered notes suggesting the researchers pressed onward despite worsening conditions before vanishing entirely. Tents were intact but showed signs of hurried movement. Food and fuel had been partially consumed, and small notes indicated continued attempts to navigate toward mapped areas or known features. Yet no subsequent trail or sign offered clues as to their ultimate fate. The combination of deep snow, shifting ice, and the vastness of the terrain left investigators with little more than speculation about what may have transpired in the days leading up to their disappearance. Rescue teams combed the valleys and glacier tongues, yet treacherous ice and snowstorms erased all evidence, leaving authorities with only fragments of equipment and fleeting impressions of human passage. Sled tracks disappeared within hours under wind and snowfall, and tents buried partially in drifts offered few tangible clues. Attempts to triangulate the team's location using notes and previous observations proved nearly impossible. Each expedition into the park demonstrated the Arctic's capacity to erase its visitors, with conditions that outmatched both planning and experience. and no subsequent search could definitively explain the researchers' fate. Sami herders and guides spoke of concealed crevasses, avalanche-prone slopes, and sudden weather shifts, emphasizing the Arctic's hidden dangers that modern instruments alone could not predict. For centuries, local knowledge had allowed communities to survive and travel through Sarak's valleys and passes safely, yet even this expertise highlighted the vulnerability of outsiders relying solely on scientific training. The contrast between seasoned local awareness and formal research protocols underscored the unpredictability of the terrain and suggested how easily even skilled professionals could be overcome by the elements. Even with modern research techniques and detailed Arctic mapping, Sarak remains a place where 20th-century expertise could not prevent a team from vanishing without a trace. The park's labyrinthine valleys, frozen rivers, and isolated glaciers continue to challenge those who attempt to navigate them, revealing that some mysteries of human disappearance are dictated not by negligence or error, but by the uncompromising power of wilderness. Among frozen valleys and isolated peaks, the researchers' trail has vanished completely, leaving the Arctic to guard its secrets in absolute silence. The Madidi Jungle Biological Survey 2000. A team of biologists entered Bolivia's Madidi National Park in 2000, intending to survey its remote rivers and dense jungle, yet none would return from the territory they sought to document. Madidi, a protected area spanning thousands of square kilometres, is renowned for unparalleled biodiversity and a network of rivers that twist through thick, unmapped rainforest. The expedition began with optimism and careful planning, with maps, GPS devices and scientific instruments in hand, but the jungle's scale and complexity quickly rendered their movements uncertain. Within days, their progress became a series of faint traces in a living landscape that could conceal and erase human presence almost instantly. Madidi had long attracted researchers eager to study its endemic species and ecological systems, yet the park's reputation for sudden floods, hidden swamps and impenetrable vegetation preceded every scientific plan. Expeditions into this territory demanded more than knowledge. They required adaptability, endurance, and constant vigilance. For decades, few teams ventured deep into the region during the wet season, when rivers swell unpredictably and trails become nearly impassable. The 2000 survey was part of a broader effort to document flora and fauna in previously unexplored areas, but the expedition entered a realm that resisted control and comprehension, where every step forward was contested by the jungle itself. Winding rivers carved the landscape into a labyrinth of islands and flooded forest, while towering canopy and thick undergrowth reduced visibility to mere meters and muffled every sound beyond immediate surroundings. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense foliage, and sudden showers transformed the terrain into slick mud and fast-flowing watercourses. Paths that appeared stable could conceal sinkholes, submerged roots, or sudden drops. The team's reliance on maps and GPS was challenged by the difficulty of translating digital coordinates into the chaotic three-dimensional space of the jungle, where rivers bend unpredictably and vegetation can shift over weeks. The forest itself seemed to move, folding back over any trace of human passage. The researchers carried GPS devices, cameras, and biological sampling kits, protected by lightweight rain gear, yet even the most advanced equipment struggled to function reliably amid relentless humidity and torrential rainfall. Batteries drained faster than anticipated, lenses fogged constantly, and electronic compasses occasionally misread due to dense canopy interference. Specimens were collected and catalogued meticulously, but the climate made preservation difficult. Collected plants wilted, insects escaped enclosures, and delicate amphibians required constant attention. Despite these challenges, the team remained determined, understanding that every observation might provide insight into one of the planet's most complex and fragile ecosystems. Progress relied on small canoes, improvised rafts, and painstaking foot travel through muddy trails, each movement slowed by vines, fallen trees, and the constant threat of treacherous footing. Canoes were sometimes caught on submerged logs or swept into eddies, forcing the team to portage supplies through nearly impassable undergrowth. Walking paths that seemed navigable one day were flooded the next, erasing trails and leaving each campsite harder to relocate. Even minor injuries, twisted ankles or abrasions, could have outsized consequences in a setting where extraction or rescue was difficult and communication was limited. Every day, the physical and mental endurance of the researchers is tested. Early entries documented rare amphibians, elusive mammals, and unusual plant formations, revealing both the richness of the ecosystem and the meticulous attention the team paid to their fieldwork. Notes described leafcutter ants constructing vast underground colonies, river dolphins moving silently through flooded channels, and orchids that bloomed only under precise light conditions. Camera lenses captured glimpses of jaguars, tapirs, and monkeys, yet each image also recorded the encroaching shadow of the forest, hinting at a wilderness that could absorb human presence without acknowledgement. These observations underscored both the expedition's scientific success and the subtle danger of overconfidence in an environment designed to conceal. Mechanical failures, impassable river sections, and sudden storms began to disrupt schedules, while fatigue and insect-borne illness slowly eroded the team's ability to maintain consistent progress. Radios sometimes failed due to interference, and GPS readings occasionally became unreliable under dense canopy. Mosquito-borne illnesses and fungal infections further weakened the researchers, who were nonetheless committed to pressing deeper into unexplored territory. Notes suggested a combination of determination and desperation, as the team attempted to complete surveys while navigating conditions that became increasingly hazardous with every passing day. Campsites were discovered abandoned, with partially catalogued specimens and uncollected notes, suggesting the team had pressed onward into increasingly inaccessible terrain before vanishing completely. Personal belongings and half-prepared meals offered no clues beyond fleeting human activity. Equipment was scattered across muddy ground, but there was no indication of forced conflict or animal predation, only signs that the team had continued onward into regions where the jungle swallowed any evidence of passage. The forest density rendered it nearly impossible to trace movement more than a few dozen meters, and rivers could have carried belongings away entirely. Subsequent search efforts were frustrated by dense jungle, shifting waterways, and flooded terrain, leaving rescuers with only fleeting impressions of human presence and scattered, inconclusive evidence. Helicopter sweeps revealed a thick canopy but no campsites. Boats and canoes were limited to navigable rivers, yet even these routes shifted with seasonal flooding. Local guides assisted, offering knowledge of safe passages and likely hazards, but the forest seemed to conceal every trace of the expedition, as if the team had never existed. Each search only reinforced the impossibility of fully mapping or controlling the rainforest environment. Indigenous communities familiar with the region described hidden sinkholes, deceptive river channels, and treacherous quicksand, highlighting hazards that the team's scientific preparation could not fully anticipate. Oral knowledge and generations of experience emphasized the subtle dangers invisible to even the most meticulous planners. Waterways that appeared calm could collapse into whirlpools, terrain that looked passable could give way without warning. The contrast between local understanding and technological preparation highlighted the unpredictability of Madidi, where even modern science meets limits imposed by nature's design. Even with 21st century technology, satellite imagery, and expert planning, Madidi's labyrinthine rivers and dense rainforest proved capable of erasing a modern expedition without a trace. The park remained as enigmatic as ever, a place where the environment itself dictates the terms of human presence. Maps, instruments, and careful observation could not prevent disappearance, and the region retained its capacity to conceal, confuse, and ultimately reclaim those who dared to venture too far. Amid the tangled vines and ever-shifting waterways, the researchers disappeared entirely, leaving the rainforest to guard its mysteries in silence that no human map could penetrate.